History doesn't remember generals. It remembers the myths they left smoldering in their wake. A farmer, a drunk, a traitor, a butcher, a prophet. Some marched for freedom, some for empire, most for something they never fully understood. Their names became schools, highways, warships, and bedtime warnings. But behind every monument is a man who made a choice and watched men die because of it. This is not a list. This is a séance, a walk through the bloodstained chessboard of American power. Welcome to the greatest generals of the U.S. George Washington, before he was the first president, before he was the general, before he became the face on the dollar bill, George Washington was a man balancing the weight of an unmade nation on the edge of a saber. He wasn't born into greatness. He built it with the silence of a man who had seen enough noise to last 10 lifetimes, the son of a middling tobacco planter in the backwater of colonial Virginia. Washington was tall, quiet, and brooding. By the age of 16, he was already a surveyor, mapping the wild lands of the frontier. But cartography was never the end game. It was the prelude to war. And Washington, stubborn, disciplined, and hungry, was already being carved into legend by the grindstone of duty. His early military ventures were clumsy. During the French and Indian War, he made mistakes. Big ones. He triggered skirmishes he couldn't finish, signed surrender documents he didn't understand, and learned that glory was a mirage that disappeared once the shooting stopped. But he also learned something else, what not to do, and more importantly, how to learn from failure. That more than anything would define George Washington. Not brilliance, not genius, but sheer endurance. So when the fires of revolution caught the 13 colonies in 1775, and when the Continental Congress needed someone to lead a makeshift army of farmers, blacksmiths, and teenage idealists against the greatest military force on earth, they chose the man who had the most scars and the fewest illusions. Washington did not win battles with overwhelming force. He often didn't win them at all. What he did was hold. Through chaos, retreat, and bitter cold, he held. When half his army deserted and the other half had no shoes, he held. When Congress failed to supply him, when his own officers doubted him, when his enemies were within musket range, he did not break. He held. Valley Forge wasn't just a winter, it was a crucible. The cold was so brutal that men froze to death in their sleep. Washington stayed in a log hut alongside his men, wrapped in a threadbare cloak, watching over a dying army. He wrote letters by candlelight, pleading for supplies, organizing discipline, enforcing sanitation. He demanded that no man under his command steal, abuse civilians, or lose discipline. If the revolution would die, it would not die in shame. Washington's genius was strategic, not tactical. He knew he couldn't destroy the British Empire, but he could exhaust it, stretch it, bleed it, and like a great stone in a river, he could endure until the current wore itself out. And so he played a game of patience. He avoided annihilation. He struck where it counted, and when he crossed the Delaware River in the dead of night on Christmas Eve, leading a ragged force through an ice-choked river to surprise a garrison of Hessians at Trenton, he reminded the world that willpower was a weapon. The victory didn't just turn the tide, it proved the revolution was alive. That Washington, the immovable center of a fractured cause, could still cut deep when needed. He endured betrayals. Benedict Arnold, Charles Lee, and conspiracies from within and without. He faced down mutinies, starvation, the collapse of morale, and still he stood tall, always in uniform, always calm, always composed. When the war ended in 1783, and the British finally evacuated New York, Washington entered the city in silence. No pomp, no trumpet, just the quiet authority of a man who had carried a country on his back and now wanted to lay it down. And here is where Washington's greatness becomes undeniable, because the moment he could have taken power, he gave it up. He resigned his military commission to Congress. Voluntarily, he returned to Mount Vernon, to his farm, to civilian life. The man who had become the most powerful figure in America walked away. Kings don't do that. Conquerors don't do that. But Washington did. That singular act was noticed around the world. King George III, upon hearing of the resignation, reportedly said, "If he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world." And he did. But destiny wasn't finished with George Washington. Because when the Constitution was ratified and the infant republic needed someone to set the tone, someone to define what a president should be, there was only one choice. He didn't want it. He was tired, old, worn from war and grief, but he accepted because he always did what needed to be done. As president, he invented the role from scratch. No crown, no throne, just service. He refused the title of Your Highness. He insisted on Mr. President. He limited himself to 2 terms. He built the model of civilian leadership that every president since has been measured against. His farewell address was not a victory lap. It was a warning against factions, against foreign entanglements, against the corrosion of national unity. He could see the fractures forming, and he tried, one last time, to hold them together. George Washington did not win by brilliance. He won by steadiness, by moral authority, by being, in the end, exactly what the revolution needed him to be, the fixed point around which chaos could orbit without tearing the whole thing apart. He was not perfect. He owned slaves. He made decisions that modern eyes can and should question, but even there we find contradiction. He freed his slaves in his will, the only founding father to do so, a man formed by his time, but one who strained, at the end, to reach beyond it. And when he died, the country mourned as if the earth itself had shifted. In a way it had. The living embodiment of national unity was gone. But the myth of Washington, the calm hand in the storm, the man who walked away from power, the general who never gave up, remained. It still does. Because in the story of America, there has always been a question. Who will hold the line when everything else collapses? George Washington did. And then, when the cause was won, he let it go. But not everyone lets go. Some generals grip their power like a lifeline. Some fight not for unity, but for vengeance, for pride, for victory at any cost. Which brings us to the next man. He didn't just fight the Civil War. He survived it, and he drank through it. Ulysses S. Grant. He didn't look like a conqueror. He stood barely over 5 feet 8 inches. Narrow shoulders, slouching frame, brown beard, muddy boots, plain blue uniform, often unbuttoned, rumpled, battle-stained. Ulysses S. Grant wasn't a man who entered a room. He lingered into it, quiet as mist, his eyes dark with calculation, his voice barely above a murmur. He rode like a cavalry ghost. He drank like a man chasing silence. And when war came, he didn't rise to meet it. He absorbed it. Born in 1822 in a wooden house in Point Pleasant, Ohio, Hiram Ulysses Grant was not destined for mythology. He was awkward and shy, more comfortable with horses than people. His father, Jesse, arranged his appointment to West Point, but a clerical error listed him as Ulysses S. Grant. He kept the name. The Army was a machine, and Grant adapted to the gears. He graduated 21st out of 39, good at mathematics, better with horses, terrible at regulations, quiet, unassuming. He would have disappeared entirely into the fog of peacetime had it not been for the Mexican-American War. There, Grant learned how wars were won and how they were wasted. He saw Zachary Taylor's simplicity and Winfield Scott's complexity. He fought bravely, wrote letters constantly, and saw blood up close. He once galloped under fire to retrieve a supply wagon. Another time, he climbed a bell tower in the middle of a battle to call artillery fire, but when the war ended, there was no upward path. He was shuffled to remote postings and separated from his family. Loneliness crept in. Alcohol followed. The Army asked him to resign. He did, and for the next 7 years, Grant failed. He tried farming, bad soil, tried real estate, worse clients, tried selling firewood, barely made coins. He wore worn clothes and pawned his watch. At times, he begged groceries on credit. No one remembered the war hero now. He was a man in the margins of history. Then in 1861, the country split, and Grant, quietly, got on a horse and rode toward the sound of war. He didn't demand command. He worked as a clerk for the Illinois governor, helping organize volunteers. It was only when men needed leaders that they found, dusty and unglamorous, U.S. Grant, willing, competent, invisible. By summer, he was a colonel. By fall, a brigadier general. But his rise wasn't dramatic. It was relentless. In February 1862, Grant struck his first blow at Fort Henry and then Fort Donelson. When the Confederate commander requested terms, Grant replied with what would become legend. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. 2 words lit across the northern press like cannon flashes. Unconditional surrender. That wasn't his actual name, but no one cared. The myth had begun. Grant was not a glamorous strategist. He wasn't given to rhetorical flourishes or saber-drawn speeches, but he possessed a rare gift. He understood momentum. While others hesitated, debated, or waited for orders, Grant moved, always forward, always toward contact. He knew war was friction. The side that flinched less would win. At Shiloh in April 1862, he didn't flinch. The Confederates surprised him. The first day was brutal, but Grant did not panic. As thousands fell, he counterattacked the next morning and drove them back. The cost was enormous, over 23,000 casualties. The press branded him a butcher. Congress muttered, but Lincoln wisely said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Grant understood that the war had changed. This wasn't Napoleonic chess. It was a meat grinder. Victory would come not with elegant marches, but with endurance, logistics, and pressure. And he played the long game like a master. He moved down the Mississippi Valley like a scythe. His campaign against Vicksburg in 1863 was a symphony of siege, maneuver, and deception. He cut off Confederate supply lines, starved the city, bombarded it for weeks. And on July 4th, Vicksburg surrendered. It was the day after Gettysburg. The Confederacy, split in two, had begun to hemorrhage. Grant had become something rare. A general the soldiers trusted and the politicians feared, but he remained the same man. When he was promoted to lieutenant general in 1864, becoming the first to hold that rank since George Washington, he did not celebrate. He packed his bags and rode east. He had a war to end. His strategy was brutal. Director. Unrelenting. He knew what it would take. The war was a cancer, and he would cut it out with cold steel. He faced Robert E. Lee in the tangled forests of the wilderness, and then at Spotsylvania, he lost men, thousands, but he kept moving forward. He wrote to Washington, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." And he did. At Cold Harbor, Union losses were catastrophic. Thousands fell in minutes. Grant admitted it was a mistake, one of the few he ever acknowledged. But even then, he didn't retreat. He swung south, crossed the James River, laid siege to Petersburg. He knew what Lee needed to survive: food, rails, ammunition, and he cut them off one by one. He turned warfare into a slow, grinding noose. And in April 1865, the rope snapped shut. Richmond fell. Lee fled west, his men starving and surrounded. At Appomattox, Grant met him not as a victor, but as a man ready to close a wound. Grant was dressed in a dusty field coat. Lee wore full ceremonial gray. The contrast was stark, but so was the tone. There was no punishment, no parade, just the pen. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their horses, no arrests, no hangings. "The war is over," Grant said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." And with that, the most brutal conflict in American history ended, not in vengeance, but in mercy. Grant could have basked in the light of his triumph. Instead, he faded. He traveled. He refused power, but America would not let him go. In 1868, the people called him to the presidency. They needed peace, honor, stability. They got half of that. As president, Grant governed like a soldier. Loyal, trusting, direct. He had no taste for politics, and even less for betrayal. His cabinet was riddled with corruption, though rarely did the blame reach him directly. Still, the stench of scandal followed. But Grant's true legacy wasn't in the smoke-filled rooms. It was in his fight for civil rights. He crushed the Ku Klux Klan, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, sent federal troops to protect black voters. When Southern states defied Reconstruction, Grant pushed back harder. He may have failed as a manager, but not as a moral compass. Yet history, for a long time, forgot that. The scandals won the headlines. The battles faded. The hero of Appomattox became the symbol of Gilded Age failure until the end. In 1884, Grant was diagnosed with terminal throat cancer. He was broke, swindled in a financial scam that ruined his family. So he picked up a pen, and in pain, while coughing blood, he began to write. He wrote his personal memoirs not for glory, but to save his family from poverty. He rode on porches in pain, with tears in his eyes and fire in his lungs, and he finished just days before he died. When the book was published, by Mark Twain no less, it became a bestseller. America, it turned out, remembered after all. And in that final act, Ulysses S. Grant did what he'd always done. He endured, he persisted, and when everything else fell away, he finished the job. They called him a butcher, a drunk, a failed president, but none of it stuck. Because in the end, he was the man who held the line when it mattered most. He didn't outtalk his enemies, he outlasted them. That's what made Grant great. He didn't just win the war, he carried it across his back and never dropped it. But the war was never just Grant's to carry. It had another architect, another master of maneuver. A man as elegant as Grant was blunt, as adored as Grant was doubted. A Southern gentleman, a battlefield genius, a figure of near religious reverence. His name was Robert E. Lee, and for 4 years, he made every Union victory look like a funeral. Robert E. Lee. He was the Confederacy's sword and its soul, refined, revered, tragic. Even among his enemies, Robert Edward Lee commanded respect not through conquest, but through character. His name would become a lightning rod for generations to come, scrawled on monuments, burned into memory, debated in classrooms, and whispered on battlefields long turned to dust. But before he was legend, he was simply a man with a choice. Born in 1807 at Stratford Hall, Virginia, Lee was the son of Revolutionary War cavalry hero Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, a man whose fame far outpaced his fortune. The family name was noble, but their finances were in ruins. And yet young Robert absorbed the ideals of classical honor like oxygen, stoicism, duty, and sacrifice. He was raised in the Southern Code, but educated in the Enlightenment. He knew the Bible, Latin, the laws of war, and the words of Cicero. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that one day he would be asked to pick between two halves of the same country, and that he would break the Union in doing so. At West Point, Lee was a phenomenon. He graduated second in his class in 1829, without a single demerit, not one. Precision was his religion. He was quiet, disciplined, composed, a natural engineer with the temperament of a monk and the demeanor of a gentleman. For the next 2 decades, he served with near-invisible excellence. He fortified harbors, built defenses, and led without spectacle. In the Mexican-American War, he caught the attention of Winfield Scott himself, who called Lee the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. He was brave under fire, brilliant in maneuver, and incorruptibly loyal. His rise through the ranks was steady, almost inevitable. But it was not the battlefield that would define him. It was the battlefield he walked away from, and the one he chose to enter. In 1861, as Southern states seceded and the Union trembled, Abraham Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee command of the entire U.S. Army. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the highest honor imaginable. But for Lee, it was a poisoned chalice. He believed slavery was wrong. He had written that it was a moral and political evil. And yet he owned slaves. He freed them only gradually, often only after court mandates. His conscience warred with his culture. His loyalty to the United States warred with his loyalty to Virginia. When his home state left the Union, Lee faced the crucible that would define him forever. He declined Lincoln's offer, resigned his commission, and joined the Confederacy. He later wrote, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." In that moment, he wasn't choosing slavery or rebellion, at least not in his own mind. He was choosing Virginia, and through that choice, he would lead an army against the very Constitution he had once sworn to uphold. Lee was named commander of the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862, and from the moment he took command, he brought something no other Confederate general had: vision. He was not just a tactician. He was a grand strategist, a master of terrain, deception, and momentum. In the 7 days battles, Lee drove George McClellan's far superior forces away from Richmond. In 2nd Manassas, he humiliated Union General Pope, and then came Antietam, September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day in American military history. Lee had invaded the North, hoping to shift the political tide. His army was outnumbered, stretched thin, and cornered near Sharpsburg, Maryland. What followed was a day of carnage that left over 22,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. And yet, Lee held, barely. He retreated, battered but not broken. To the Confederacy, Lee became more than a general. He became the general. Stone-faced, unshaken, fatherly. To many in the South, he embodied honor itself, devotion without question. But with every battle he won, the Confederacy grew more emboldened, more defiant, and more dependent on a war it could not afford to fight forever. Then came Chancellorsville, his masterpiece. Outnumbered 2-1, Lee split his army in the face of the enemy, sending Stonewall Jackson on a flanking march that caught the Union completely off guard. The result was one of the most lopsided victories of the war. But it came at a cost. Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men and died days later. Lee lost not just a lieutenant, but a kindred soul. Still, Lee pressed on. In 1863, he made the fateful decision to invade the North once more, this time into Pennsylvania. He was aiming for a knockout blow, a victory on Union soil that would force Lincoln to sue for peace. What he got was Gettysburg. For 3 days, armies clashed on the fields and hills of southern Pennsylvania. The fighting was apocalyptic. Lee's confidence, perhaps inflated by previous triumphs, led to a fatal decision on July 3rd, Pickett's charge. He ordered 12,500 men to march across an open field toward the center of the Union line, over a mile of ground, under artillery fire. It was valor in its purest and most foolish form. The charge was repelled with devastating losses. Lee's army never truly recovered. He offered to resign. Jefferson Davis refused to let him go, and so Lee returned to Virginia, where he would spend the next 2 years conducting one of the most brilliant defensive campaigns in history. Against overwhelming odds, against superior numbers and endless Union supplies, he outmaneuvered, outdug, and outfought nearly every general the North threw at him until they sent Grant. From 1864 to 1865, Lee was caught in a slow-motion death spiral. Grant refused to retreat, refused to stop. He bled Lee's army dry, drove him into the trenches at Petersburg, and slowly crushed the life from the Confederate war effort. By April 1865, Lee had nothing left. No food, no ammunition, no men. He tried one last retreat, one last gamble to escape westward and continue the fight. But Union cavalry cut him off. At Appomattox Courthouse, he surrendered. The meeting with Grant was quiet. Lee wore a formal dress uniform, his saber polished. Grant wore a dusty private's jacket. No ceremony, no taunting, just peace. Lee signed the terms, mounted his horse, and rode back through the lines of Union soldiers who stood in silence, then slowly raised their hats in salute. It was not victory, it was respect. After the war, Lee became president of Washington College. He urged his fellow Southerners to accept the end of the conflict, to rebuild, to reconcile. But even in peace, his image hardened into something larger than life. Statues, paintings, myths. He never wanted them. He never asked for sainthood. But the South, in its loss, needed a figure to anchor its pride. And so Lee became the marble man, the noble rebel, the great gray ghost of the lost cause. But history is not marble. It breathes. It bleeds. And the truth of Lee is more complicated than the myth. He fought for a cause he knew was flawed. He chose loyalty to home over loyalty to country. He was a brilliant general in service of a disastrous idea, and he bore it with dignity, not defiance. There is a quiet tragedy in Lee's story. Not the tragedy of defeat, but the tragedy of brilliance bent toward a hopeless cause, of valor misplaced, of honor entwined with a war that should never have been fought. Still, for all the debates that rage about his memory, one fact remains. On the battlefield, Robert E. Lee was one of the most formidable commanders in American history. He turned an army of farmers and volunteers into a force that outmaneuvered, outwitted, and outfought superior foes for 4 relentless years. And in the end, when all was lost, he surrendered not out of cowardice, but out of a final act of service to spare his men further ruin. He lost the war, but he never lost control of himself. His name would echo in controversy, revered by some, condemned by others, but never forgotten, because Lee, more than any other general, left behind not just a trail of battles, but a national reckoning. The next man left something else, a legacy built not on surrender, but on return. Because the next general didn't just fight wars, he staged comebacks, larger than life. surrounded by cameras, riding through Pacific waves like a ghost in Aviators. Douglas MacArthur, he was the son of a Civil War hero, born with the smell of gunpowder in his blood and destiny coiled in the shadow of his boots. Douglas MacArthur didn't just walk through history, he strode through it like a man convinced he had written the script. From the trenches of World War I to the beaches of the Pacific, from the ashes of the Philippines to the raw agony of Korea, MacArthur was never merely present. He was a spectacle, theater, judgment and thunder wrapped in khaki and stars. And through it all, one truth rang clear. Douglas MacArthur never backed down. Not from war, not from power, not even from the commander-in-chief. He was born in 1880 at the Little Rock Barracks in Arkansas, the son of Arthur MacArthur, a decorated Union general. War wasn't a chapter in his life. It was the prologue. Raised in military posts, educated at West Point, he graduated first in his class in 1903, a perfectionist, a reformer, a man who would remake the Army to fit the dimensions of his ambition. In World War I, MacArthur commanded the 42nd Rainbow Division and turned mud-soaked French trenches into testing grounds for a new kind of officer. He wore a soft cap instead of a helmet, refused to dig in, and moved up and down the lines under fire. His men followed him not because he barked orders, but because he lived out front, where the bullets hummed like locusts. By war's end, he had earned 7 Silver Stars, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and more decorations than he could wear at once. He returned home a war hero, but not a passive one. He began carving the Army into a more mobile, modern force. In the 1930s, as Army Chief of Staff, he warned Congress that America's defenses were outdated, underfunded, and dangerously naive. Few listened. Isolationism was the gospel of the day, and MacArthur, with his grand style and orator's cadence, seemed out of step. But Asia was listening. In 1935, MacArthur accepted a position as military advisor to the Commonwealth of the Philippines. It wasn't just a job, it was a new frontier. He believed the Philippines would be the crucible of the next Great War. He trained a local army, built coastal defenses, and all the while watched the slow rising tide of Japanese militarism with an anger that burned white-hot beneath his famously cool exterior. Then came December 1941. Pearl Harbor, a date that changed everything. Just hours later, Japanese forces struck the Philippines. MacArthur's forward strategy collapsed under the speed and fury of the assault. Manila fell. He and his men retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and then to the island fortress of Corregidor. Food ran out, ammunition dwindled, disease ran wild. Still, MacArthur refused evacuation. It took a direct order from President Roosevelt to pull him out. He left in silence, under cover of night, boarding a PT boat and slipping past Japanese lines to Australia. He was not leaving in defeat, not in his mind, because as he reached safety, he uttered a sentence that would define his myth forever. I shall return. It wasn't a speech, it was a vow, and MacArthur kept it. Over the next 2.5 years, he led an island-hopping campaign that pushed the Japanese Empire back, one jungle, one beachhead at a time. Unlike other commanders who directed battles from behind maps, MacArthur landed with his troops, always immaculate. Aviator sunglasses, corncob pipe, patrician stare. He was both general and performance artist, a symbol for the press, for the troops, for the world. At Lake Gulf, he waited ashore before the cameras, the surf licking at his polished boots. The message was not subtle. The liberator had returned, but MacArthur didn't just want victory. He wanted justice and total control. When the Japanese surrendered in 1945, MacArthur accepted it aboard the USS Missouri with a solemnity that was almost sacred, and then he was handed something no American general had ever wielded before: absolute authority over a defeated empire. From 1945 to 1951, MacArthur became the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan. Not in name, in fact. He ruled with near monarchical power, but instead of vengeance, he chose reconstruction. He rewrote Japan's constitution, demilitarized its institutions, empowered women, protected the emperor as a figurehead, and laid the foundation for a democratic transformation so radical it stunned the world. Japan did not fall into chaos. It rose, prosperous, pacifist, and stable. And MacArthur became something rarer than a conqueror, a builder. But history would not let him end there. In 1950, the Korean War erupted. Communist North Korea invaded the South, backed by China and the Soviet Union. The Cold War turned hot. MacArthur, 70 years old and long past the age of ordinary generals, was summoned once more. He took command of UN forces and did what only he could do, redefine the battlefield. With North Korean troops pushing deep into the South, MacArthur planned a counterattack of astonishing boldness, an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city far behind enemy lines. Military advisors said it was suicidal. The tides were treacherous, the city heavily defended. He did it anyway. On September 15th, 1950, MacArthur's forces stormed Incheon. The landing was a complete success. North Korean forces were routed. Seoul was recaptured. The war, it seemed, had turned. MacArthur pushed north all the way to the Yalu River, the border with China, and then the tide turned again. Chinese troops flooded across the border, hundreds of thousands. A brutal, bitter winter offensive. American forces were pushed back, and MacArthur, furious at political constraints, demanded authority to strike Chinese bases across the border, even with nuclear weapons. Washington said no. MacArthur responded with defiance. He sent letters to Congress, gave unauthorized statements to the press. He challenged the very principle of civilian control of the military. President Truman, after months of tension, made the hardest decision of his presidency. He relieved Douglas MacArthur of command. The fallout was seismic. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome. He addressed a joint session of Congress in a televised speech that became legend. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. It was poetic, dignified, and deceptive because MacArthur did not fade. He remained a symbol of honor, of defiance, of martial grandeur. For some, he was the last American Caesar, exiled by weak politicians. For others, a dangerous ego in uniform. But even his critics acknowledged the scale of his achievements. He won victories not only on battlefields, but in hearts and minds. He restored a broken Japan. He liberated the Philippines. He changed the map of the Pacific and wrote the blueprint for post-war Asia. He died in 1964, buried in Norfolk, Virginia, far from the jungles and mountains where he'd carved his legend. He left no memoir as Grant did, no presidency like Eisenhower, just a legacy shaped by war, loyalty, and the stubborn refusal to yield. MacArthur wasn't perfect. He was proud, controlling, often insubordinate. But when nations crumbled and empires teetered, he stood tall, impeccable, resolute. He did not seek the approval of history. He commanded it. But for all his thunder and theater, his legacy would be followed by a different kind of general. Quieter, more patient, a strategist of balance rather than spectacle, a man who fought in the same war, but chose the ballot over the bayonet. Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was calm at the center of the storm. Not a battlefield titan like Patton. Not a thunderclap of ego like MacArthur. Dwight D. Eisenhower fought his wars not with bayonets or tanks, but with trust, timing, and the weight of impossible decisions. He never fired a shot in anger, yet commanded the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen. And when the fires of history demanded a man who could lead not just armies but nations, it was Eisenhower, the Kansan with a poker face and a general's spine, who stepped forward. Born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, and raised in Abilene, Kansas, Kansas, Dwight David Eisenhower was molded in the hard soil of Middle America. His family was poor in wealth, but rich in faith, discipline, and duty. He was the third of 7 sons, a child of perseverance and patience. In the quiet neighborhoods and wheat fields of Kansas, he learned that character wasn't what you shouted. It was what you did when no one was looking. He entered West Point in 1911, not out of ambition for glory, but because it offered a free education. He graduated in 1915, part of the legendary class the stars fell on, and entered a world on the brink of transformation. But World War I came and went without giving Eisenhower a single moment in combat. He was kept stateside, training tank crews, implementing strategy, and watching others rise in rank and in reputation. For a man who would eventually plan the liberation of Europe, His early career was a long, frustrating stretch of obscurity. He served under generals, absorbed every lesson, and waited. He worked under John J. Pershing, Douglas MacArthur, and George C. Marshall. They noticed something rare. Eisenhower didn't seek attention. He sought efficiency. He was blunt but respectful, detail-oriented without micromanagement, and when war came again, total war, he was ready. When the United States entered World War II, the military command structure scrambled to identify not just fighters, but organizers, the kind of mind that could think in continents. Eisenhower wasn't flashy. He wasn't even the most senior, but he had something else. The ability to synthesize complex problems, manage massive egos, and keep a global war machine on track. In 1942, he was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. And just like that, Eisenhower found himself not just commanding Americans, but coordinating British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and resistance forces across thousands of miles against a foe entrenched in ideology and steel. The stakes were biblical, the politics Byzantine, but Eisenhower wore the burden with a poker face and a relentless, methodical grace. His first major test came in North Africa. Operation Torch was a baptism by fire. Logistical snarls, competing interests, supply failures, and hardened German defenses under Rommel. Eisenhower's leadership held. He managed battlefield setbacks without panic. He replaced underperforming generals with cold precision. He smoothed alliances. When British commanders bristled at American tactics, Eisenhower brokered compromise, not through force of personality, but through the sheer gravity of steadiness. He earned respect by never asking others to do what he wouldn't. From North Africa, he launched the invasions of Sicily and then mainland Italy. Progress was brutal, the terrain unforgiving, German resistance fanatical, but Eisenhower saw the war as a chain of connected problems, and he solved each link in sequence. His eye was always on the bigger prize, and that prize was France. In 1944, he was given command of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. It would be the largest amphibious assault in history. Over 150,000 men, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, months of preparation, years of planning, and on the eve of the invasion, Eisenhower faced the moment that separates generals from legends. The weather turned. Storms pounded the English Channel. Visibility vanished. Landing would be a gamble. Delaying could unravel the entire plan. Every eye turned to Eisenhower. Every life, every ship, every nation's hope balanced on a single call. He gave the order, "Okay, let's go." And on June 6th, 1944, the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy. The carnage was unimaginable. Bullets cut down entire waves of soldiers. Mines exploded under tanks. The sea turned red. And yet, by the end of the day, the beachhead held. France was breached. The wall was cracked. And the long road to Berlin had begun. But before the first boat hit the shore, Eisenhower did something else. He wrote a letter accepting full responsibility if the invasion failed. It read, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He kept that letter in his pocket. That is what leadership looks like when no one is watching. From Normandy, the war surged forward. Eisenhower directed a multi-pronged push through France, into Belgium, and across the Rhine. He handled insubordination from General Patton, navigated tension with British commander Bernard Montgomery. And as the Battle of the Bulge threatened to tear the Allied advance apart, Eisenhower absorbed the blow, coordinated the response, and delivered the counterpunch that drove Hitler's last gasp into the frozen dirt. In May 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Eisenhower, the man who had never commanded in combat during World War I, had now orchestrated the death of fascism in Europe. But victory did not intoxicate him. In a final act of moral clarity, he visited the Nazi concentration camps. The horrors of Buchenwald and Ohrdruf shattered any illusions. Eisenhower ordered that photographs be taken, that soldiers and politicians bear witness. He said, "Get it all on record now, get the films, because somewhere down the track of history, some bastard will get up and say this never happened." He understood that some battles don't end with surrender. They begin with memory. He returned home a hero. Parades, medals, a tidal wave of admiration. But Eisenhower remained grounded. No campaign for power, No chest-thumping memoir, just service. He served briefly as Army Chief of Staff, then as President of Columbia University. But in 1952, when America stood divided, war-weary from Korea, anxious in the Cold War, and desperate for leadership, Eisenhower was called once more. "I like Ike." The slogan swept the nation. He won the presidency in a landslide, and his command shifted from armies to politics. As president, Eisenhower was not a revolutionary. He was a stabilizer, a man who knew that the future could not be built on hysteria. He ended the Korean War through quiet diplomacy and forceful deterrence. He resisted calls to launch preemptive strikes on the Soviet Union. He kept the Cold War cold. At home, he expanded Social Security, built the interstate highway system, and enforced the desegregation of schools, sending federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, when local authorities defied the law. The same boots that once marched through Nazi territory now stood for civil rights in the American South. But Eisenhower's greatness was not loud. He warned of a rising danger not in foreign lands, but in American factories and boardrooms. In his farewell address, he spoke plainly, "Beware the military-industrial complex." Coming from a five-star general, those words were not protest. They were prophecy. He died in 1969, buried in Abilene, Kansas, next to the fields of his boyhood. He left no marble throne, no dynasty, no monument to ego, just a nation stronger, steadier, and, if only briefly, unified. Eisenhower did not conquer. He orchestrated. He did not provoke. He planned. He did not dominate history. He aligned it, and when he left without applause. But the roads he paved, the bridges he built, the peace he held together by sheer moral force, they're still standing, still holding. Because sometimes the greatest general isn't the one who charges. Sometimes it's the one who never lets the line break. But the next general, he didn't hold the line. He shattered it. He marched through Georgia like a storm in blue. William Tecumseh Sherman. He wasn't polished. He wasn't diplomatic. He wasn't the kind of general you put on a coin or carve into a marble arch. But when the Union needed the war to end, really end, it turned to a man who didn't speak like a politician, didn't fight like a traditionalist, and didn't believe that a war could be won without first burning away the myths that started it. William Tecumseh Sherman believed in war. Not the romance of it, not the trumpet-blaring, banner-waving fantasy of it, the truth of it, the horror of it, the way it broke people, the way it changed them, the way it was supposed to. And then he made the South believe it too. Born in 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio, Sherman was named after the famous Shawnee leader Tecumseh, a warrior of a different kind. Fierce, brilliant, and unafraid of overwhelming odds. His father died when he was 9, and he was raised by a family friend, Thomas Ewing, a powerful senator who got young Sherman into West Point. He graduated in 1840, sixth in his class. Brilliant but undisciplined. Respected but restless. He served without distinction in the Mexican-American War, saw the battlefield, smelled the blood. But something about peacetime didn't sit right with him. He bounced between military posts and civilian work. Banking, law, education, nothing fit. By 1861, Sherman was president of a small military academy in Louisiana, what would later become LSU. He resigned when Louisiana seceded. He made his loyalty clear. You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood. And then he marched off to make sure of it. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Sherman was assigned to organize and train troops. But when he took command in Kentucky, he collapsed under the pressure, physically and mentally. Newspapers called him insane. The army quietly removed him from the front, but they didn't understand the man they were dismissing. Because Sherman wasn't broken, he was awakening. He returned to duty under Ulysses S. Grant during the campaign against Vicksburg, and there, something clicked. Where Grant was stoic, Sherman was fire. Where Grant held the line, Sherman shattered it. They were opposites, and perfect together. After Vicksburg fell, Sherman was given command of the Western Theater. His job? Crack the Confederate heartland wide open, and he did it the only way he knew how. Totally. In 1864, Sherman launched his campaign into Georgia. Atlanta was the target, but not the goal. Sherman understood something that many generals, even in his own army, didn't. Wars were not won by taking cities. They were won by breaking the enemy's will to fight. And so, when he took Atlanta, he didn't just occupy it. He torched it. He burned factories, railroads, supply lines, not out of vengeance, but out of strategy. He called it hard war, not against civilians, but against the machinery that sustained rebellion. War, he believed, had to be felt. It had to be personal, otherwise it would never truly end. Then came his march, from Atlanta to Savannah, 300 miles through Confederate territory, with no supply lines, no reinforcements, and no mercy. Sherman's army moved like a ghost, fast, unstoppable, burning everything that could be used by the enemy. Mills, railroads, telegraph wires, cotton fields, entire towns. He wasn't just marching through the South, he was erasing its illusions. And yet, he wasn't a monster. His orders forbade the killing of civilians. His troops were disciplined by the standards of the time, but the destruction was deliberate. Sherman wanted the South to understand that rebellion had a cost, and that the cost would be paid in fire. In December 1864, he offered Savannah to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. It was more than a gesture. It was a warning. The Confederacy was collapsing, and Sherman was the hammer. But he didn't stop. He turned north, cutting through South Carolina, where secession had begun, and destroyed it with particular fury. Cities burned, rail lines twisted into Sherman's neckties, plantations leveled. The war's birthplace was being turned into its grave. By the time he reached North Carolina, the Confederacy was in its death rattle. And then he stopped. On April 26, 1865, weeks after Lee's surrender to Grant, Sherman accepted the surrender of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, ending hostilities in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. The war was over, but peace would not come easily. In Washington, politicians bristled at Sherman's generosity. His surrender terms were deemed too lenient. His bluntness, once tolerated, was now dangerous. He was ordered to revoke them. He obeyed, but never forgot the insult. Sherman declined to run for office. He declined to commentate. He declined every chance to carve himself into the political marble of the era. He simply said, "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if elected." Instead, he returned to the army. He became commanding general of the United States Army, oversaw Reconstruction, waged brutal campaigns against Native American tribes in the West. His philosophy of total war extended beyond the Civil War into a nation still expanding, still consuming. But for all his ferocity, there was method in it. He believed in victory because he believed that half measures created longer wars, more suffering, more death. He died in 1891, having never tried to rewrite his legacy. He didn't whitewash his campaigns. He didn't romanticize the fire. He simply said, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it." Sherman was many things. A genius, a scourge, a tactician, a poet of destruction. But above all, he was honest. Honest about what war was. Honest about what it did. And honest about what it took to end one. He didn't fight for fame. He fought to finish. And finish he did. But even as Sherman tore the South apart, another general was preparing to put something new together. A modern military, forged in trench warfare and continental ambition. A general who would lead a new kind of army into a new kind of war. John J. Pershing. He was called Blackjack, though not always kindly. He wore his uniform like armor, walked with the gravity of a man who had buried too many soldiers, and believed in every fiber of his disciplined frame that America should never fight halfway. John Joseph Pershing was not a glory seeker, not a philosopher general, not a man who softened his language for comfort. He was, simply and unapologetically, a commander. And when the world tore itself apart in the First World War, it was Pershing who stitched together a brand new idea, the American military as a global force. He was born in 1860 in rural Missouri, just before the country plunged into civil war. He grew up in its aftermath, in a nation exhausted by death, but restless for something new. As a young man, Pershing showed little of the flair that defined other generals. No drama, no bold pronouncements, just a quiet drive to master the rules and then bend them only when absolutely necessary. He graduated from West Point in 1886, ranking 30th out of 77. Not outstanding, but respectable. He was assigned to cavalry regiments out west, where he fought in skirmishes against Apache and Sioux tribes. It was brutal work, often moral in shade and ambiguous in mission. Pershing did not flinch. He enforced discipline, demanded order, and refused to compromise. In the 1890s, he was assigned to command a regiment of Buffalo Soldiers, African-American troops of the 10th Cavalry. In a deeply segregated army, it was a significant and controversial post. His respect for their service earned him the nickname Black Jack, a moniker originally used as a racial slur by his white peers. He wore it like armor, turning insult into reputation. He fought in the Spanish-American War, served in the Philippines, where he suppressed insurrections with the same cold efficiency that marked his entire career. He taught at West Point, studied law, built a resume that was less myth and more stone. Heavy, solid, undeniable, but nothing, not even his relentless climb, prepared him for personal tragedy. In 1915, while stationed in Texas, Pershing received the worst news a man can hear. His wife and 3 daughters had died in a fire at the Presidio in San Francisco. Only his young son survived. The grief did not shatter him. It hardened him. Friends said he became more distant, more focused, more resolved. The following year, when tensions flared along the Mexican border, Pershing was sent to hunt down Pancho Villa after a cross-border raid killed American civilians. He pursued Villa for months through the deserts of northern Mexico, never caught him, but the campaign gave him experience in fast-moving, large-unit command. Then in 1917 came the call that would define his legacy. The United States entered World War I. Europe had been at war for 3 years. Millions were dead. Trench lines stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps. Gas choked the air. Artillery reduced forests to splinters. Machine guns made open field charges suicide. And into this industrial slaughterhouse stepped a man from Missouri, wearing 4 stars and carrying a mandate: build an American army from scratch. Train it, supply it, transport it across an ocean, and throw it into the fight. Pershing was made commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. He faced immediate pressure from the Allies, especially the French and British, to simply plug his men into their exhausted ranks as replacements. Pershing refused. "We came here to fight as an independent force," he told them, "not to be absorbed." It was more than national pride. It was a doctrine. Pershing believed American troops should fight under American command, and that they could turn the tide, not just fill the graves. He spent a year building the force, training it, whipping green volunteers into shape. He demanded discipline, marksmanship, stamina. He rejected the trench warfare mindset. He believed the war had to become mobile again, fluid, fast, offensive. His critics called him outdated, but Pershing was playing the long game. In 1918, when the German spring offensives shattered Allied lines and drove toward Paris, Pershing released his troops into the fight. At Cantigny, American troops seized and held a German position. At Belleau Wood, Marines fought with such ferocity that German troops called them Teufelshunde, devil dogs. At Soissons, the OEF helped stop the German advance. And then came the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was the largest battle in U.S. military history. Over 1.2 million American troops, 47 days of hell. Artillery, mud, machine gun nests, gas, and wire. Pershing directed it all, adjusting commands, replacing divisions, pushing forward with relentless determination. His troops took over 26,000 dead and 95,000 wounded, but they broke the German line. It was the beginning of the end. The armistice followed. Germany collapsed. The Allies stood victorious, and John J. Pershing, who had entered the war commanding nothing but ideas, returned home at the head of a modern army. Congress made him General of the Armies, a rank held only once before by George Washington. He spent his later years codifying what he had learned. He reorganized the army, fought for better training, better logistics, and permanent planning structures. He believed America could no longer retreat from the world. It had to be ready. He died in 1948, honored but not idolized, not beloved but respected. His funeral was a state occasion. His casket lay in state under the Capitol dome, and when he was lowered into the ground at Arlington National Cemetery, the thunder of modern war was already echoing overseas. Pershing never built monuments to himself. He built an army that would go on to fight in every corner of the globe, that would land on the beaches of Normandy, that would storm the ridges of Korea, that would chase shadows through the jungles of Vietnam and deserts of the Middle East. He turned the United States military into something new, Global, professional, permanent. He wasn't a romantic, he was the blueprint. But every blueprint needs a field test. And while Pershing designed the frame, the next general would crash through it like a man born for the saddle, swinging wildly between glory and chaos. Because some generals are systems, and some are fire. George S. Patton, he believed in destiny, in reincarnation, in Alexander the Great, and the thunder gods of war. George Smith Patton didn't just fight battles, he performed them, as if the world were a grand stage, and he had been cast by fate and fury as the lead actor in every campaign. There was no off switch, no pause button, no mute function. Everything about Patton was turned up. His ego, his energy, his language, his style, his violence. He wore ivory-handled pistols, quoted Homer and the Bible in the same breath, and swore like a preacher on fire. But beneath the theatrics lived one of the most effective field commanders the U.S. Army ever unleashed. Ruthless, agile, brilliant. He didn't invent blitzkrieg, but he spoke its language fluently. And when the world needed a general to drive tanks through the belly of fascism, George S. Patton grabbed the throttle and never looked back. He was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, to a family steeped in Confederate legacy and military myth. His ancestors fought in the Civil War. On the southern side, he grew up reading stories of knights, ancient warriors, epic duels. The Iliad and the Old Testament shaped his worldview more than any textbook. From an early age, Patton didn't just want to serve. He wanted to become immortal. He attended the Virginia Military Institute, then West Point, where he struggled academically but excelled in military science. He graduated in 1909, already a man out of time, obsessed with chivalry in an era of machines. But when World War I broke out, the machines gave him a language he understood. He became one of America's first tank officers, serving under John J. Pershing in France. Patton was wounded in the Meuse-Argonne offensive and earned the Distinguished Service Cross for bravery. The war ended before he could become what he wanted to be. Legend, but the seeds were planted. Between the wars, Patton wrote papers on tank warfare. He saw the future of battle in steel, oil, and speed. While others clung to the past, Patton was already dreaming of a battlefield where maneuver was king. He trained, drilled, and demanded perfection. He didn't just want men who could fight. He wanted killers who could think. And then came World War II. When Hitler rolled into Poland, Patton rolled up his sleeves. He wasn't interested in politics. He wanted action. When the U.S. entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Patton was finally let off the leash. His first major campaign was in North Africa. There he found chaos. Poor discipline, sloppy logistics, low morale. He whipped the Second Corps into shape with profanity and precision. He forced soldiers to shave, cleaned up supply lines, fired weak officers. Then he led the invasion of Sicily in 1943 and beat the British to Messina in a race that was both symbolic and savage. But glory came with shadows. In Sicily, Patton slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a field hospital twice, accused him of cowardice, ordered him back to the front. News of the incident nearly ended his career. He was sidelined, forced to apologize. The press turned. The high command doubted him, but Patton wasn't done. Not even close. In the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared for D-Day, Patton was made the centerpiece of a deception operation. He was placed in command of a fictitious army, the First U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Inflatable tanks, dummy camps, fake radio traffic, and at the center of it all, Patton, thundering and posturing like a man who hadn't just been benched, but promoted. The ruse worked. The Germans bought it. And when the real invasion hit Normandy, their reserve divisions waited in the wrong place for weeks. Finally, in July 1944, Patton was returned to command. He took over the newly formed Third Army and roared across France in one of the most dazzling advances in military history. In 6 weeks, Patton's tanks crossed 600 miles. Town after town fell. German defenses shattered under the weight of speed, fire, and momentum. He didn't wait for permission. He moved with instinct, reading the enemy like a predator. Fuel, not resistance, was his biggest obstacle. At times, he begged for more gasoline like a junkie looking for a fix. Not for himself, but for his armored columns. But war, like fate, always corrects its arc. In December 1944, Hitler launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. American forces were surrounded in Bastogne, the roads were frozen, weather grounded air support, and Patton turned. He wheeled his entire army north on ice-covered roads in sub-zero cold and struck the German flank. His arrival broke the siege. The Bulge collapsed, and Patton once again had done the impossible. As the war neared its end, Patton pushed into Germany. He liberated concentration camps, stared into the ovens, saw the cost of ideology, but even then he could not stay quiet. He criticized Allied policy, objected to the use of former Nazis in administration, questioned the post-war division of Europe. He warned of Soviet aggression. He refused to play the diplomat, and for that he was removed from command once more. In December 1945, Patton's story came to a sudden end. A car accident outside Mannheim left him paralyzed. 12 days later, he died from his injuries. He was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery alongside the men he led across Europe. There were no marble thrones, no grand processions, just rows of white crosses, and a name that even his critics couldn't ignore. George S. Patton was not easy, not subtle, not safe. He was violence, contained by discipline, fury, channeled through purpose, and when the enemy broke, it was often because Patton refused to stop charging. He believed war was man's natural state. He believed he had lived 100 lives as a warrior, and maybe he had. But in this one, he became something else, not just a general, a storm in uniform. But while Patton was blitzkrieg in flesh, the man who helped win the American Revolution was something else entirely. Quiet, green, uncelebrated, and exactly what Washington needed. Nathaniel Greene. He wasn't born for war. He had a limp, a wheeze, no formal education in the art of killing. He was a Quaker, a pacifist by faith, a merchant by trade. But when the revolution came calling, Nathaniel Greene answered. Not with fury, not with fame, but with quiet, relentless competence. If George Washington was the soul of the Continental Army, Greene was its nervous system, holding together shattered limbs, redirecting dying nerves, keeping the entire fragile body of rebellion from collapsing under its own exhaustion. And unlike many of the era's warrior poets and speechmakers, Greene didn't write soaring letters or chase heroic last stands. He just solved problems, one after another, until the British war machine in the South went from unstoppable to unsustainable. Born in 1742 in Warwick, Rhode Island, Greene came from humble stock. His family were devout Quakers, pacifists, abolitionists, strict in dress and manner. Greene grew up with both the language of restraint and the tools of labor. He worked in his father's iron forge, studied military history in secret, read Caesar, Polybius, and Machiavelli behind the counter of his family's shop. By the time tensions flared in 1775, Greene had been expelled from his Quaker meeting for his growing interest in military affairs. When the fighting started, he helped form a local militia, and through a combination of social standing and sheer initiative, was made a brigadier general by the Continental Congress. He had never led men in combat, but he would learn fast. Greene first served in the Siege of Boston, where his organizational skills stood out immediately. While other commanders bickered, Greene arranged supply lines, enforced discipline, and won the loyalty of troops through competence rather than charisma. George Washington took notice. Over the next 5 years, Greene became one of Washington's most trusted lieutenants. He fought in New York, held ground at Trenton, slogged through the mud at Brandywine and Germantown. He wasn't flashy. He didn't win headlines, but Washington kept giving him more responsibility, and Greene never once betrayed the trust. In 1780, the war in the South turned critical. British forces under General Charles Cornwallis were cutting through the Carolinas like a bayonet through linen. Cities fell, armies disintegrated, morale collapsed. The Continental Army needed a general. A real one. Washington chose Greene. He was sent south to take command of a broken army. Starving, disease-ridden, undisciplined. What he found was not a fighting force. It was a ghost. He didn't panic. He didn't rage. He got to work. Greene understood something few others did. The British couldn't be beaten head-on in open battle. They had numbers, training, and supply chains the Americans simply couldn't match. So he decided to win by not losing. He split his forces, forced Cornwallis to chase him, wore down British supplies, avoided catastrophic defeats while grinding the enemy into frustration. And then, in January 1781, he sent one of his detachments under Daniel Morgan to face British troops at Cowpens. It was a masterpiece. The Americans feigned retreat, then counterattacked with precision, over 800 British casualties. One of the most decisive victories of the war. Cornwallis was furious. He pursued Greene across North Carolina, desperate to land a knockout blow, but Greene made him bleed for every mile. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Greene allowed Cornwallis to attack him, then made him pay. The British technically won the field, but at a staggering cost. Over 25% of Cornwallis's army was gone, men who couldn't be replaced, officers who had no successors. It was a Pyrrhic victory, and Greene, still alive, still in command, kept retreating just enough to survive, but close enough to keep pressure on the British throat. The strategy worked. Cornwallis, unable to destroy Greene's army or pacify the South, withdrew to Yorktown to resupply and regroup. There, Washington, marching from the north with French forces, trapped him. The trap only worked because Greene had kept Cornwallis moving, bleeding, and off balance for months. Yorktown surrendered in October 1781. The war was functionally over. Greene didn't deliver the final blow, but he was the reason the final blow could be delivered at all. After the war, Greene returned to private life. Broke, worn down, he had sacrificed everything for a country still trying to define itself. He died in 1786 at the age of 43, too soon to enjoy the nation he helped forge. There were no grand parades, no myth-making eulogies, but those who understood war understood Greene. Washington once said, "Greene is as dangerous as Washington himself." He meant it as the highest praise, because Greene didn't win the war with one great victory. He won it by never giving up the fight, by doing the job no one else could, by keeping the light alive in the darkest theater of the Revolution. And when it was over, he didn't ask for anything. Not medals, not monuments, just peace. But there was another general in that same war, brilliant, charismatic, devastating in battle, who did ask for more. A man who won too well, too fast, and wanted too much. Winfield Scott. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall, built like a column of stone, and carried himself with the dignified bearing of a man who believed, honestly, unapologetically, that he was the American military. Winfield Scott wasn't a general. He was the general for half a century through wars, rebellions, and presidencies, from the dusty battlefields of 1812 to the looming thunderclouds of Civil War. By the time the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, Scott had worn a uniform longer than most of the officers around him had been alive. They called him Old Fuss and Feathers, a nickname that mocked his obsession with discipline, uniforms, and decorum. But behind the spit-polished facade lived a man of ferocious capability, a battlefield titan, a master of logistics, a strategist who knew that victory didn't come from shouting loud. It came from planning deeper, moving smarter, and outlasting the enemy's ability to resist. Born in 1786 in Virginia, Scott was a product of the early republic, born before the Constitution was ratified, raised on the war stories of revolution, and educated in the art of war before the country really understood what that meant. He entered the military in 1808, a young officer with a taste for drama, and found his first real test in the War of 1812. That war did not start well for the United States. Poorly trained militia, fragmented leadership, and underestimation of the British left American forces reeling. Washington, D.C. was burned, forts were lost, the Great Lakes were contested. Scott, however, stood apart. He fought at the battles of Chippewa and Lundy's Lane in 1814, both brutal, close-range slogs on the Canadian border. At Chippewa, his disciplined regulars routed a larger British force in one of the few clear-cut American victories of the war. At Lundy's Lane, he was wounded, badly, yet refused to leave the field until the last possible moment. His courage became legend. He returned home a national hero and was promoted to Major General. In the decades that followed, he turned his attention to reform. He standardized training, introduced tactical manuals, professionalized the army into something resembling a real fighting force. He believed soldiers should be educated, fit, and drilled, not just brave. He carried that vision into the Mexican-American War in 1847, and that's where Scott reached his apex, not just in rank, but in raw military genius. While Zachary Taylor won fame in northern Mexico, it was Scott who led the amphibious assault on Veracruz and marched straight to the heart of Mexico. It was the first major U.S. amphibious landing in history, an operation involving over 10,000 men, naval bombardment, siege engineering, and a coordinated land-sea campaign. Scott handled it all with meticulous precision. From Veracruz, he pushed inland toward Mexico City, facing both the Mexican army and rugged terrain. He won every major engagement: Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco, Molino del Rey, and then finally Chapultepec, the fortress on the hill, guarded by cadets. Steeped in myth, Scott ordered the assault. The Americans stormed the walls, took the heights, and opened the road to the capital. On September 14, 1847, U.S. troops entered Mexico City. It was the first and only time an American army would conquer a foreign capital and occupy it. And at the head of it stood Winfield Scott. It was his masterpiece, and the world noticed. European generals studied the campaign. Military historians wrote of its audacity and execution. Even his critics were forced to admit this was not just a victory, it was art. Scott's political stock soared. He was offered command after command. In 1852, the Whig Party nominated him for president. He lost to Franklin Pierce. The campaign was awkward, stiff, and wooden, like the man himself when forced to play politician. But even in defeat, he remained the highest-ranking officer in the land. And then came the national fracture. In 1861, as Southern states seceded, the Union turned once again to Scott. Now 74 years old, heavy-set, in failing health, he could barely mount a horse, but his mind was still sharp. It was Scott who proposed the Anaconda Plan, a long-term strategy to blockade southern ports, control the Mississippi River, and squeeze the Confederacy into submission. Critics mocked it for being too slow, too passive, too indirect, but it was correct. The war would not be won in a month or a year. It would be a war of exhaustion, and Scott, old and wise, understood that before almost anyone else. He remained in command through the war's early months, guiding Abraham Lincoln and shaping the foundations of what would become the Union war effort. In October 1861, he voluntarily stepped down, making way for younger leadership. First McClellan, then Grant. But the old general had done what he always did, built a foundation. He died in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended, buried at West Point, revered, if not always understood. Winfield Scott served under every president from Jefferson to Lincoln. He fought in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Seminole Wars, the Mexican War, and oversaw the dawn of the Civil War. His career spanned more than half of American history at the time. He was not beloved, he was not warm, but he was the general who never broke, never bent, never ran. He held the line for 50 years, a pillar of the old army, a bridge to the new. And while Scott brought a nation to the gates of modern warfare, the next general would ride through the ashes of revolution and earn a nickname that sounded more like folklore than history: Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Before there was Robert E. Lee, there was his father, a whirlwind on horseback, a cavalryman whose blade flashed through the chaos of revolution and carved a legend in the saddle. Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee was a speed incarnate, riding not just with fury but with intent. Wielding his charisma as skillfully as his saber, he fought not for empire, not for glory, but for a fragile idea still finding breath. A republic, free and indivisible. And while his name would later be eclipsed by his sons, there was a time when he was the Lee history couldn't stop talking about. He was born in 1756 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into a family of privilege and position, a classic Virginian aristocrat. Refined, educated, steeped in the codes of honor and rhetoric, but unlike many of his peers, he didn't see the revolution as a chance to preserve wealth. He saw it as a crucible in which to test valor, and in that furnace he found his element. At 19, he graduated from Princeton with a degree in law and philosophy, but war was already boiling. The colonies had crossed the threshold, and in 1776, Lee joined the newly formed Continental Army. He started as a captain in a Virginia Dragoon unit. Horses, speed, sabers, raids. He was built for it. His brilliance wasn't in leading armies. It was in disrupting them. He struck fast, moved light, and vanished before British regulars could pin him down. He turned cavalry into a scalpel. His raids became nightmares whispered in British tents. They called him Light Horse Harry, not mockingly, but with wary respect. By 1778, George Washington had noticed. He elevated Lee to command the Partisan Corps, an independent unit specializing in reconnaissance, guerrilla raids, and lightning-fast engagements. Lee didn't disappoint. His finest moment came in 1781 at the Battle of Paulus Hook in New Jersey. Under cover of night, with just a few hundred men, he launched a surprise attack on a fortified British outpost. He captured over 150 enemy troops and withdrew before reinforcements arrived. The raid was surgical, daring, clean. Congress awarded him a gold medal, one of only a few given during the entire war. But it was in the Southern Campaign that Lee truly became a legend. Fighting under General Nathaniel Greene, he joined a series of brutal, small unit engagements across the Carolinas. Greene used Lee's cavalry like a scalpel, cutting supply lines, harassing enemy pickets, forcing the British to overextend. At Guilford Courthouse, Lee's men were crucial. At Eutaw Springs, they held the line when the infantry faltered. And in countless skirmishes, Tarleton's Legion, surprise ambushes, cavalry duels, Lee's mobility and initiative turned chaos into control. He didn't seek glory for its own sake, but he understood its value. He understood morale, image, spectacle. He wore the part, acted the part, delivered when it counted. But when the guns fell silent and the colonies became a country, Light Horse Harry Lee faced a challenge no battlefield could prepare him for: politics. After the war, he served in the Confederation Congress, then as governor of Virginia. He supported a strong federal government, backed the Constitution, and became one of George Washington's fiercest defenders. When Washington died in 1799, it was Lee who delivered the now iconic eulogy. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. The words etched into stone, spoken by a man who had once ridden beside Washington through the smoke of rebellion. But the new republic was not kind to its warriors, and politics would not offer Lee the same clarity as combat. His fortune collapsed due to land speculation. He was imprisoned for debt. His political career imploded. In 1812, during a riot in Baltimore, Lee tried to defend a Federalist newspaper under siege by a mob. He was beaten nearly to death, stabbed, crushed, nearly blinded. The injuries never fully healed. Broken in body and finances, he sailed to the West Indies in search of recovery. He never returned. He died in 1818 on Cumberland Island, Georgia, far from Virginia, far from the battlefields that had once made his name echo like thunder. He was buried in the quiet obscurity, but his legacy endured, not just in medals or dispatches, but in the bloodline he left behind, because his son, Robert E. Lee, would one day walk the same ground, would wear the same uniform, would fight a war against the very country his father helped create. The irony is vast, the moral tension inescapable, but Henry Lee never lived to see the country fracture. He only knew the version he helped build, stitched by hope, sealed by war, and carried, for a time, on the back of a man and his horse, galloping into the fog of history. But the next general would make his stand not on a horse, but in the wall of men that refused to move. Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He stood like a wall, and that was all it took. In the chaos of the First Battle of Bull Run, when Green Union troops surged forward and Confederate lines buckled, General Barnard B. pointed to a man whose brigade wasn't breaking, wasn't flinching, wasn't even blinking. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," he shouted. The name stuck. The myth was born. And Thomas Jonathan Jackson, quiet professor, stern Calvinist, accidental icon, became a legend of the American Civil War. But behind the nickname was a man of brutal contradictions, a genius in tactics, a fanatic in faith, a visionary of motion who moved like prophecy through the Shenandoah Valley, who outflanked and outmaneuvered armies twice his size, and who believed every bullet, every death, every flaming house and shattered line was an act of divine will. He didn't fight for applause. He fought for providence. Born in 1824 in Clarksburg, what is now West Virginia, Jackson was orphaned young. His childhood was hard, rootless. He walked miles to school, taught himself to read, carried a Bible everywhere. The hardships carved deep grooves of stoicism into him. Emotional restraint, rigid discipline, silent endurance. He entered West Point in 1842, academically underprepared, but ferociously determined. He graduated 17th out of 59. Not through brilliance, but through sheer grinding will. He fought in the Mexican-American War, earning brevet promotions for gallantry. His courage was unquestioned. His social grace, non-existent. After the war, he became a professor at the Virginia Military Institute. He taught artillery tactics and natural philosophy. His students found him stiff, awkward, and humorless. He lectured in a monotone. He was obsessed with posture, diet, and obscure ailments. He believed keeping one arm raised improved circulation. He spoke little, prayed constantly, and trusted few. But when the Union cracked in 1861, Jackson did not hesitate. He sided with Virginia, and that's when everything changed. At Bull Run, his brigade held the line against a Union advance that nearly broke the Confederate left. His presence turned panic into resolve. His troops became the Stonewall Brigade, and Jackson, previously unknown to the wider South, became its most feared and admired general. But it was in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1862 that Jackson entered the realm of military legend. With just 17,000 men, Jackson maneuvered up and down the valley, facing and defeating Union forces totaling over 60,000. He moved with impossible speed, marching his troops 30 miles a day, striking, disappearing, then striking again. His army became a ghost. His tactics were poetry in motion. He exploited terrain, misdirection, and raw aggression. He shattered Union plans to reinforce McClellan on the peninsula, bought critical time for the Confederacy, and rewrote the book on maneuver warfare. His men called themselves Jackson's Foot Cavalry, and they loved him. Not because he was warm, he wasn't. Not because he was kind, he rarely showed softness, but because he never asked them to do what he wouldn't. Because he rode with them, prayed for them, and fought like a man who believed God was riding just behind his saddle. Then came the 7 days battles, where he faltered. Slow, uncoordinated, exhausted. Critics whispered, was the myth cracking? But then came Second Manassas, where he held the Union right. Then Antietam, where he anchored the Confederate left. Then Fredericksburg, where his men repelled wave after wave of Union assault. And then came Chancellorsville, his masterpiece. In May 1863, outnumbered 2-1, General Robert E. Lee divided his army in front of a superior enemy, a move so audacious it bordered on suicidal. He gave Jackson half the army and sent him on a 12-mile flanking march through the wilderness to hit the Union right. Jackson did it flawlessly. At twilight, he slammed into the unsuspecting Union 11th Corps. The attack rolled through the forest like cannon fire through dry leaves. The Union flank collapsed. Panic spread. Night fell. Jackson had once again turned chaos into conquest, but fate does not take orders from generals. That night, while scouting ahead of his own lines, Jackson was mistaken for Union cavalry and shot by Confederate pickets. He was hit 3 times, twice in the arm, once in the hand. His left arm was amputated. Infection set in. Pneumonia followed. 8 days later, he died. His last words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." He was 39 years old. His death shattered the Confederate command. Lee, who had called Jackson his right arm, was devastated. "He has lost his left arm," Lee said. "But I have lost my right." Jackson's absence was felt almost immediately at Gettysburg, where coordination between Confederate wings broke down. The war would grind on for 2 more years, but the Confederacy would never again move with such speed, cohesion, or confidence. Jackson was not a perfect man. He owned slaves. He fought for a cause that defended the indefensible. His faith, however sincere, justified brutality. His discipline bordered on obsession. His silence on the battlefield and off could feel inhuman. But he was a master of maneuver, a prophet of speed, a man who turned inferior numbers into advantage through vision and resolve. He didn't just command troops. He rewrote the tempo of battle. And in doing so, he changed the rhythm of a war that would define the American soul for generations. But if Jackson was the South's blade, sharp and swift, the next general was a different kind of warrior entirely. He didn't need a nickname. He had a stare that broke harder men, a jaw cut from stone, and 5 Navy Crosses to his name. Chesty Puller, he wasn't born on a battlefield, but it often felt like he lived on one. From the blood-drenched jungles of Guadalcanal to the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir, Louis Burwell Chesty Puller carried the legacy of the United States Marine Corps on his shoulders like a man who didn't know how to fall. He fought in 5 wars across 5 decades. He earned more combat decorations than any Marine in history, and yet, he was never much of a politician, never much of a self-promoter, and never, ever out of the fight. He was hard, he was blunt, he was impossibly brave. He was Chesty. Born in 1898 in the tiny town of West Point, Virginia, Puller grew up hearing stories of war, Confederate soldiers, campaigns, honor, sacrifice. His great-uncle had fought under Stonewall Jackson. That kind of mythology sinks into your bones when you're young and listening close. Puller wanted war, not because he loved violence, but because he loved challenge. And he understood that the truest tests of character often come with bullets. He enrolled at the Virginia Military Institute, but left early to enlist in the Marine Corps during World War I. The war ended before he saw combat, so instead he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He stayed in uniform anyway. He was posted to Haiti, where the U.S. was enforcing order during its long and now controversial occupation. There, Puller saw his first combat. Jungle warfare, ambushes, guerrilla tactics, no clean lines, no medals for polished maneuvers, just chaos and mud and fear. He survived. Then came Nicaragua, where Puller led multiple campaigns against rebel forces in the 1920s and 30s. He was awarded his first Navy Cross, the second highest honor for valor, for leading a small patrol through enemy territory, killing multiple insurgents, and returning his men alive. Then he did it again and again. 2 more Navy Crosses for actions that bordered on suicidal, and somehow always ended in success. But it was in the Pacific theater of World War II that Puller became a Marine legend. In 1942, at Guadalcanal, he led the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, in one of the most vicious battles of the war. The fighting was relentless. Thick jungle, disease, and a fanatical enemy willing to charge through machine gun fire in human waves. One night, Puller's position was attacked from 3 sides. Outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly surrounded, he refused to retreat. Instead, he radioed for artillery, repositioned his defenses, and calmly, methodically, directed his men through the darkness. When dawn broke, over 1,400 enemy dead littered the jungle floor. Puller's Marines had held. He earned his 4th Navy Cross. Later in the war, at Cape Gloucester, he led another brutal campaign, this time through swamps, typhoons, and some of the worst terrain the Pacific had to offer. Puller didn't complain. He adapted, moved, attacked. Again and again and again. By the time World War II ended, Puller had become the most recognizable Marine in the Corps. Gruff, relentless, iconic. He walked with the swagger of a man who had seen everything and survived all of it. But he wasn't done. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, Puller, now in his 50s, wasn't sitting behind a desk. He deployed again, this time with the 1st Marine Regiment. Then came Chosin. The Chosin Reservoir campaign was one of the most savage winter battles in military history. In temperatures that dropped below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 30,000 United Nations troops were surrounded by over 120,000 Chinese soldiers. Puller didn't panic. He looked around and said, "We're surrounded." That simplifies things. It wasn't a joke. It was how he thought. If the enemy's everywhere, then you don't have to look far to find them. You just turn and fight, and that's exactly what his Marines did, breaking through encirclement, retreating under fire, carrying their wounded with them, all while inflicting massive casualties on the enemy. Puller earned his 5th Navy Cross for his leadership. He should have been promoted, made a 4-star general, given command of the whole theater, but Puller wasn't a politician. He spoke his mind, clashed with brass, didn't play nice with bureaucracy. And so, though revered by the enlisted men and junior officers who would have followed him into hell, Puller never got the final star. Instead, he retired in 1955. But even in retirement, Chesty Puller loomed over the Marine Corps like a force of nature. Recruits still shout his name at boot camp. His face still stares down from walls in mess halls. And his words, blunt, brutal, unforgettable, still echo in Marine culture. Pain is weakness, leaving the body. Take me to the brig. I want to see the real Marines. Old breed, new breed. There's not a damn bit of difference as long as it's the Marine breed. He died in 1971, buried in Virginia. No statues were needed. He was already legend, not because he was the smartest, not because he was the most strategic, but because no matter what war he was in, Haiti, Nicaragua, World War II, Korea, he did the same thing. He led, from the front, through fire, without flinching. He didn't chase history. He let it follow him. But while Chesty Puller carved his legacy with grit and gunfire, the next general commanded with balance, caution, and surgical precision. He was the quiet backbone behind the noise of World War II. Omar Bradley. He was the general without swagger. No ivory-handled pistols, no corncob pipe, no theatrical speeches or flaring temper. Omar Nelson Bradley was plain in the way granite is plain. Solid, quiet, and unyielding. He didn't command attention. He earned it. In a war filled with loud personalities and headline-making egos, Bradley stood apart by standing still. Where Patton charged, Bradley coordinated. Where MacArthur postured, Bradley calculated. He wasn't the flash of victory. He was the scaffolding behind it, and when the United States needed a steady hand to command the largest field army it had ever assembled, it didn't pick the loudest voice. It picked Omar Bradley. He was born in 1893 in Clark, Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher. His childhood was modest, rooted in discipline, humility, and faith. His father died when he was young, but his mother ensured he was educated and grounded. He entered West Point in 1911, a classmate of Dwight Eisenhower. Unlike Ike, who would become a political giant, Bradley never courted fame. His classmates called him the GE's general, because even as a cadet, he put substance over style. He graduated in 1915, a year known as the class the stars fell on. So many of its members would become generals that it seemed prophetic. But World War I ended before Bradley saw combat. He spent the next 2 decades in training roles, learning doctrine, shaping junior officers, and watching the army grow slowly in a country reluctant to believe it would ever fight on a world stage again. But Bradley was watching and waiting. In the lead up to World War II, he served under General George Marshall, who recognized in him a rare kind of competence, calm, deeply professional, with an engineer's mind for problems and a pastor's instinct for people. When war finally came, Bradley didn't ask for command. He was given it. He first served in North Africa under Patton, where he earned a reputation for cool-headedness during the campaign to take Tunisia. Then in Sicily, he helped plan and led the assault that would dislodge Axis forces from the island. His ability to work alongside the more flamboyant Patton was a masterclass in contrast. While Patton drove the headlines, Bradley quietly held the operational reins. But it was in 1944 that Omar Bradley stepped fully into the light. As the Supreme Allied Command prepared for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of France, Bradley was placed in command of the 1st U.S. Army. His task, lead American forces ashore at Utah and Omaha beaches, coordinate landings, and push inland through German defenses. It was the largest amphibious assault in human history. On June 6, 1944, under gray skies and relentless German fire, Bradley directed the American landings from a command ship off the coast. The bloodbath at Omaha threatened to stall the invasion. Troops were pinned down. The beach was a slaughterhouse. Bradley didn't panic. He redirected naval gunfire, moved landing craft, pushed engineers to clear obstacles, gave his commanders room to adapt. Slowly, the Americans gained a foothold. They broke through. After D-Day, Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group, over 1.3 million men, the largest group of American soldiers ever assembled under a single commander. From the Normandy hedgerows to the banks of the Rhine, Bradley oversaw the U.S. advance across France, Belgium, and into Germany. He wasn't without flaws. His decision to press toward the Ardennes without fully securing his flanks left the Americans vulnerable. In December 1944, Hitler exploited that gap and launched the last great German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. But even as chaos spread and snow choked the forests of Belgium, Bradley remained composed. He redirected reinforcements, coordinated logistics under blizzard conditions, trusted his subordinates, and once again, the line held. By May 1945, Nazi Germany had collapsed. Bradley had led his forces through some of the hardest, bloodiest fighting in modern history. and done so without theatrics, without scandal, without losing the trust of the men under his command. He was promoted to General of the Army, 5 stars, joining the ranks of Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Marshall. But Bradley's story didn't end with the war. He served as head of the Veterans Administration, then as the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He oversaw the reorganization of America's military into a global force during the early years of the Cold War. He advised Truman on the Korean War, and when MacArthur pushed too far, when the general in Korea threatened to defy civilian control, Bradley backed Truman's decision to relieve him. It wasn't personal, it was constitutional, and Bradley, more than anyone, understood that generals serve nations, not the other way around. He retired in 1953, having shaped not just one war, but the entire doctrine of American power in the 20th century. He published his memoirs, A Soldier's Story, which read less like a victory lap and more like a meticulous after-action report. It was detailed, honest, unromantic, like the man himself. He died in 1981 at the age of 88, buried with full honors. No scandal, no controversy, just respect. Omar Bradley was never the loudest general in the room, but he was often the most essential. He didn't chase headlines, he delivered results. And when history demanded not just courage but consistency, Bradley delivered both. But if Bradley was the calm brain of the Allied machine, the next general was its fracture, a man whose brilliance lit the revolution on fire, and whose ambition nearly tore it in half. Benedict Arnold. To some, his name is treason. To others, tragedy. In the American lexicon, Benedict Arnold is shorthand for betrayal, for ambition turned sour, for greatness squandered. But before he tried to sell out West Point, before he switched coats, before he became the most infamous traitor in American history, Benedict Arnold was a hero, a real one, a man who risked everything for a cause that, at first, burned just as brightly in him as it did in Washington or Greene, and that's what makes him dangerous. Not that he betrayed America, but that America trusted him first. He was born in 1741 in Norwich, Connecticut. His early life was turbulent. His father, a successful merchant, drank himself into ruin. Young Benedict grew up watching a family name decay in slow motion. He entered into business as a pharmacist, a bookseller, a merchant captain, but the spark of something greater never left him. He was drawn to danger, always had been. When war erupted in 1775, Arnold didn't wait for orders. He helped seize Fort Ticonderoga alongside Ethan Allen, an early, bloodless victory that gave the revolutionaries much-needed artillery. But already, tensions showed. Arnold chafed under Allen's leadership, wanted credit, resented sharing it. The seeds of discontent were sown early. Then came the Quebec expedition. In late 1775, Arnold led a nightmarish march through the Maine wilderness, over mountains, through freezing rivers, starving, soaked, pushing forward when other men turned back. By the time he reached Quebec, nearly half his force was dead or incapacitated. And yet, he attacked. It failed. He was wounded, the city held. But Congress took notice. For his bravery and sacrifice, Arnold was promoted to brigadier general, and for a time he lived up to it. In 1776 at Lake Champlain, he oversaw the construction of a small fleet and delayed a massive British invasion force with a desperate naval battle at Valcour Island. He lost, but his delaying action bought the Revolution another year. In 1777, during the Saratoga campaign, Arnold again proved indispensable. Under General Horatio Gates, his rival in nearly every sense, Arnold was sidelined from field command, but when the fighting began, he defied orders and rode into the fray. He led charges, inspired men, personally rallied faltering regiments. He was shot in the leg, the same leg wounded at Quebec. Saratoga became the turning point of the war. France entered the conflict on the side of the Americans. And Benedict Arnold, bleeding in the dirt, was its most important catalyst. But Gates got the glory, and Arnold got nothing but more pain. As he recovered, Congress passed him over for promotion. Junior officers were promoted ahead of him. He wrote angry letters, demanded justice. Washington sympathized, but the political wheels were turning, and Arnold was being crushed beneath them. Then came his appointment as military governor of Philadelphia. It should have been a reward. Instead, it was a trap. He clashed with civilians, lived extravagantly, fell in love with Peggy Shippen, a young woman from a loyalist family, and began to feel, deeply and personally, that the revolution no longer valued him. And perhaps in some small way, he was right. But what he did next crossed a line no reputation ever fully comes back from. He opened secret correspondence with the British. He offered to deliver West Point, a critical fort on the Hudson River, to the enemy. For money, for a commission, for a clean slate with a crown. It almost worked. His British contact, Major John Andre, was caught en route with the plans in his boot. Arnold fled, just barely escaping capture. Andre was hanged as a spy. West Point was saved, and Benedict Arnold's name became synonymous with betrayal. He was commissioned as a brigadier general in the British Army. He led raids in Virginia and Connecticut, burning towns he once might have defended. He justified it all, said he was ending the war faster, bringing order back to a broken continent. But no one believed him. Not really. Even the British distrusted him. They paid him, used him, but never embraced him. When the war ended, Arnold moved to London. He tried to build a business, tried to write his legacy, but the stain never lifted. He died in 1801, sick, bitter, forgotten. He was buried in England under the name Benedict Arnold, late general in the Army of the United States of America, because history isn't written in black and white. It's written in betrayal and bravery, often in the same breath, and that's what makes Benedict Arnold so haunting. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a battlefield genius, a fearless commander, a man who bled for his country, and then tried to sell it. His name will never escape the curse it earned, nor should it. But if we forget why he fell, ambition unmet, pride wounded, loyalty strained, we risk missing the deeper tragedy, that the same fire that makes a great general can also burn the Republic down. But the next general, he wouldn't betray anything. He walked with quiet strength. He fought from Korea to Normandy to Berlin, and carried the Allied legacy on his back through a new kind of war. Matthew Ridgway. He jumped into Normandy with a Bible in his chest pocket and a grenade in his teeth. Not a poet, not a philosopher, just a soldier's soldier. Matthew Bunker Ridgway never asked to be a symbol. He preferred the sound of boots over brass, of parachute snaps over speeches. He believed leadership meant being close enough to the front to hear the bullets, and return fire if necessary. In an age when wars were becoming bureaucratic and generals were becoming distant, Ridgway still smelled like cordite and mud. He didn't rewrite strategy. He didn't invent doctrine. What he did, what he was present. In the foxhole, in the frost, in the hard gray places where courage isn't a quote, but a decision you make when the radios go dead and the sky starts falling. He was born in 1895 at Fort Monroe, Virginia, to an Army family. Raised in a life of uniforms and transfers, he internalized discipline before he understood it. He entered West Point and graduated in 1917, just as the First World War was drawing the United States into its grasp. But like so many young officers of his generation, Ridgway didn't see combat in the First World War. He trained, he organized, he watched others go, and he waited. By the time the next war came, he wasn't a raw lieutenant anymore. He was a full colonel, hardened, precise, and ready. During World War II, Ridgway was chosen to lead the 82nd Infantry Division, as it transformed into the 82nd Airborne. The idea was revolutionary. An entire division dropped from the sky into enemy territory. Fast, light, deadly. Ridgway didn't just buy in, he built it. He demanded tough training, night jumps, long marches, live fire drills. If his men were going to leap out of airplanes into machine gun nests, they'd need more than enthusiasm. They'd need grit. In July 1943, Ridgway led the 82nd in the invasion of Sicily, the first major combat parachute drop in American history. It was chaos. Anti-aircraft fire, friendly fire, units scattered. And yet, the paratroopers regrouped, took key positions, and proved the concept. Airborne assault worked. Ridgway followed them into Italy, then back to England to prepare for the invasion of France. On the night of June 5th, 1944, Ridgway climbed aboard a C-47 with his division. He carried no weapon, just a first aid kit, a canteen, grenades, and a radio. When the green light hit, he jumped into Normandy, behind enemy lines. No fanfare, no guarantee he'd survive. But he did. The 82nd Airborne helped secure the flank of Utah Beach, held key bridges, and disrupted German movements. Ridgway was everywhere, walking among his men, steady under fire, issuing orders, dragging wounded to cover. One soldier later said, "When Ridgway showed up, the chaos started to make sense. After Normandy, he led the division in Operation Market Garden, the massive airborne assault into the Netherlands. The operation failed at the strategic level, but Ridgway's troops fought with grim determination. He adapted, pulled his men out, held the line. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. Again, Ridgway was in the thick of it, rushing reinforcements to plug holes in the American line, coordinating paratroopers in the frozen woods of the Ardennes. When the Germans broke through, Ridgway made sure they didn't break past. By the war's end, he was among the most respected commanders in the army, but his most crucial role was still ahead. In 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South, triggering the Korean War. U.S. forces under General Walton Walker were pushed back into a perimeter around Pusan. Then came the Incheon landing under MacArthur, then the push north to the Yalu, then disaster. China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border. The U.S. 8th Army collapsed in retreat. Morale was shattered. Soldiers fled. Units disintegrated. MacArthur needed someone to stop the bleeding. He sent for Ridgway. In December 1950, Ridgway arrived in Korea. His first move wasn't to retreat further. It was to attack. He restored discipline, rebuilt shattered lines, met personally with commanders, walked the front, reminded everyone they were soldiers, not victims. He ordered aggressive patrols, hit back, took hills, and slowly the retreat stopped. Then it reversed. Under Ridgway's command, the U.S. Army in Korea clawed its way back to the 38th parallel. His troops were still outnumbered, still freezing, still exhausted, but they were fighting again, winning again. And then MacArthur went too far. He clashed publicly with President Truman, demanding the right to expand the war into China. Truman refused. MacArthur disobeyed. Truman relieved him and promoted Ridgway. He became Supreme Commander for the Allied forces in Korea. It was the most difficult, thankless job in the Army. A stalemate was setting in. Public support was fading. Ridgway didn't flinch. He held the line. He negotiated. He fought. He endured. He didn't try to turn Korea into a grand spectacle. He tried to end it. And when the war froze into armistice talks, it was Ridgway who made sure American honor hadn't been traded for fantasy. After Korea, he served as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, then Army Chief of Staff. He fought to modernize the military, resisted reliance on nuclear weapons, warned of overextending U.S. forces into unwinnable conflicts. He warned about Vietnam before it exploded. But as usual, Ridgway wasn't flashy. He wasn't quoted. He just spoke the truth. He retired in 1955, a 4-star general, decorated, quiet, underrated. He died in 1993, aged 98, a soldier to the very end. He was buried in Arlington, not far from the men he had jumped with, led with, bled with, and when the night seemed darkest, he was always the one moving forward. He didn't write poetry, he was poetry, written in mud and steel and unyielding will. But while Ridgway fought through frost and fire, the next general rode from log cabins to presidential mansions, a man who won battles with muskets and elections with silence. William Henry Harrison. He was born into revolution, raised by the rhetoric of freedom, and died a month after taking the presidency. His legacy defined less by speeches and more by a battle cry still echoing across the Ohio River Valley. Remember the raisin. Before the parades and the presidency, before the frigid inauguration that killed him, William Henry Harrison was a frontier general, a tactician of rough ground, irregular war, and half-frozen encampments. He didn't win with style, he won with timing. And for a brief, brutal window, he was the man who held the Northwest of a fractured America with grit, gunpowder, and the slow-burning promise of revenge. Born in 1773 in Charles City County, Virginia, Harrison was the last president born before the Declaration of Independence. His father, Benjamin Harrison V, was a signer of that declaration, part of the revolutionary elite, but young William wasn't content to remain a plantation son. He wanted the military, action, terrain, so at 18, he dropped out of medical school, joined the army, and was sent to the far edge of the American frontier. There he found chaos. The The newly independent United States was trying to expand into the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, but Native American tribes, backed by British interests, were fighting back with fury. The frontier wasn't civilization. It was a chessboard made of rivers, dense forests, and ambushes. It was war without rules. Harrison proved himself quickly. Under General Mad Anthony Wayne, he served at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, where the U.S. finally crushed a major native confederacy and gained control of Ohio. Harrison watched, learned, rose. But his true command came in 1801, when he was appointed governor of the Indiana Territory. That's when his name became legend and complicated. As governor, Harrison's job was twofold: negotiate treaties with native tribes and secure land for white settlers. Over the next decade, he signed dozens of treaties that stripped tribes of millions of acres, often using coercion, confusion, and occasionally whiskey as negotiating tools. One of the men who watched this with growing anger was a Shawnee warrior named Tecumseh. Tecumseh wasn't just another tribal leader. He was building a pan-Indian alliance, a resistance movement spanning multiple tribes and regions. His brother, known as the Prophet, preached spiritual revival. Harrison saw it as sedition. The powder keg blew in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison marched with a force of over 1,000 men to Prophetstown, Tecumseh's base of operations, while Tecumseh was away recruiting allies. The Prophet, acting prematurely, launched a pre-dawn assault on Harrison's camp. It was fierce, confusing. The American line nearly broke, but Harrison's men held. They counterattacked, burned Prophetstown. The battle was technically indecisive, but Harrison claimed victory. In the public imagination, he became the man who defeated Tecumseh, a title he would use for the rest of his life. War soon engulfed the entire region. In 1812, as America declared war on Britain again, the Northwest became a key theater. Detroit was lost. Forts fell. Settlers panicked. Native uprisings spread. Then came the massacre at the River Raisin in present-day Michigan, where British and native forces slaughtered, surrendered American troops. Survivors were butchered. Villages were torched. It sent a shockwave through the frontier. Harrison took command of the Army of the Northwest. He built forts, rebuilt morale, organized supplies, and then in 1813, he struck. At the Battle of the Thames in Ontario, Harrison's army clashed with British troops and their native allies, led by Tecumseh himself. This time the Americans had cavalry, coordination, numbers. They charged. The British lines broke. Tecumseh fought to the end and died. His dream of a native confederation died with him. Harrison's men found his body. The victory was decisive. The frontier war in the Northwest effectively ended. And Harrison? He was hailed as a hero. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. That would be the campaign slogan decades later. But for now, Harrison retired from military life and drifted through various political appointments. He served as a congressman, a senator, and a diplomat to Colombia, but he was never particularly effective or popular. Not until the Whig Party, desperate for a war hero, plucked him from semi-obscurity and turned him into a symbol. In 1840, they ran him for president against Martin Van Buren. They portrayed Harrison as a rugged frontiersman, living in a log cabin, drinking hard cider, fighting Indians and British alike. In reality, he came from Virginia aristocracy, but the myth worked. He won in a landslide, and then he died. 31 days into his presidency, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in history. 2 hours. No coat, cold weather. He caught pneumonia and died a month later. The first president to die in office, a ghost presidency. But Harrison's military legacy endured. He was not a tactical genius. He was not a scholar of war, but he was relentless. He held the line when everything was falling apart, and in the forests of the Old Northwest, when America was still deciding whether it would expand or collapse, Harrison chose to advance. Not with flair, not with drama, but with force. And force in that era shaped everything. But the next general would redefine force entirely. His war wouldn't be fought with muskets, but missiles. He'd command through satellites, broadcast strategy through televised addresses, and send thunder across the desert with precision that would make old generals blink. Norman Schwarzkopf. He came from a different war, a different generation, a different world. one wired with satellites etched by oil pipelines and broadcast live across continents. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf didn't just command armies. He appeared on screens, in living rooms, in history. At a time when American military confidence had been fractured by Vietnam and muddied by Cold War ambiguity, Schwarzkopf stepped into the spotlight like a man who meant to be there, not for ego, for clarity. Because war, he believed, wasn't supposed to be endless. It was supposed to be decisive. Born in 1934 in Trenton, New Jersey, Herbert Norman Schwarzkopf Jr. was raised under the gaze of history. His father, Norman Sr., was a West Point graduate and military officer, most famous for founding and commanding the New Jersey State Police and playing a key role in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping investigation. Discipline, duty, and precision weren't just values. They were household rules. Young Norman spent parts of his youth in Iran, where his father worked with the Shah's military. There, he witnessed geopolitics up close. It shaped him, made him comfortable in unfamiliar territory, gave him an instinct for complexity. He attended West Point, graduated in 1956, and earned an advanced degree in mechanical engineering from USC. But his mind wasn't just built for theory. He volunteered for Vietnam early. He wasn't just looking to lead. He was looking to understand what war had become. And what he found in Vietnam shook him. During 2 combat tours, he led troops through dense jungle, ambiguous objectives, and the slow, grinding erosion of morale. He saw heroism and failure. He watched strategic decisions falter under political pressure. He saw men die for hills that were abandoned days later. He was wounded, decorated, disillusioned, but not broken. Vietnam taught him that leadership wasn't rank. It was proximity. He believed generals had to be there, had to see it, smell it, touch the consequences of their orders. After the war, he rose steadily through the ranks, commanded brigades, shaped doctrine, oversaw training. He gained a reputation for clarity, decisiveness, and empathy for the soldier on the ground. By the late 1980s, as tensions shifted from Cold War standoff to Middle Eastern instability, Schwarzkopf became commander of U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM. Then came Iraq. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The world held its breath. The memory of Vietnam lingered like smoke. Was America going to intervene? Could it? President George H.W. Bush drew a line. The coalition was formed, over 30 nations, hundreds of thousands of troops, billions of dollars in hardware. But someone had to coordinate it. Enter Schwarzkopf. The media quickly gave him a nickname, Stormin' Norman. He hated it. He didn't shout, he didn't bluster. He planned, with precision. Over the next 5 months, he orchestrated Operation Desert Shield, the largest military buildup since World War II. He didn't just prepare for war, he prepared to end one. When diplomacy failed, Desert Storm began. January 17th, 1991. A 5-week air campaign. Satellites, smart bombs, stealth aircraft. Iraqi infrastructure collapsed under surgical strikes. Command centers, runways, radar installations, crippled. And then the ground assault. February 24th. Schwarzkopf unleashed a left-hook maneuver that became textbook. While coalition forces pinned Iraqi troops along the Kuwaiti front, U.S. armored divisions swept west, then north, then east, encircling Saddam's elite Republican Guard. 4 days later, the war was over. 100 hours. That's how long the ground campaign lasted. Coalition casualties were astonishingly low. Iraqi losses? Catastrophic. The speed, coordination, and overwhelming dominance stunned the world. Schwarzkopf became a household name. At press conferences, he was blunt, articulate, sometimes darkly funny. He explained operations without spin. He didn't soften the damage inflicted, but he always made space for the humanity of the soldier. He cried when he talked about the dead, showed pictures, named names. He said, "I am not in the business of shedding human blood, but if it's required, I'll do it." But he didn't chase victory parades. He refused to run for office, turned down calls to enter politics, and declined to sell his uniform for ambition. He retired in 1991, a national icon. Wrote his memoir, It Doesn't Take a Hero, a title that spoke volumes, because Schwarzkopf didn't believe in myths. He believed in preparation, leadership, and ending wars the moment you've won them. He died in 2012. No scandal, no spectacle, just legacy. In a world of gray zones, insurgencies, and forever wars, his campaign in Desert Storm feels almost cinematic in its simplicity. Build the force, strike the target, win the war, go home. He never underestimated the cost, but he never forgot the mission. And though he never said it loudly, Schwarzkopf left behind a quiet standard: fight like hell, but fight to finish. And if Schwarzkopf brought closure with speed, the next general brought victory with patience. Measured, reluctant, but when the cannons roared, he stood at Gettysburg and never stepped back. George Meade. He did not seek glory. He did not crave power. He did not wear a cape of charisma or chase history with a torch in hand. But for 3 days in July 1863, George Gordon Meade held the fate of a fractured nation in his hands. And he held it steady. While generals with louder voices and shinier reputations circled the spotlight, Meade stood in the storm of Gettysburg, firm, focused, and just furious enough to survive it. He didn't start the war with a title. He ended it with a turning point. Meade was born in 1815 in Cadiz, Spain of all places. His father was a wealthy American merchant who'd lost his fortune backing the wrong political cause. By the time George was a teenager, the family was back in the United States, broke. From the start, Meade understood hardship. He attended West Point, class of 1835, not out of patriotism, but necessity. It was a free education and a guaranteed job. He graduated 19th in his class and joined the Army, only to resign a year later for civilian life. Engineering, surveying, quiet work, but the military called him back during the Mexican-American War. There, Meade served not as a battlefield hero, but as a topographical engineer. He mapped roads, directed artillery placement, and laid the bones of modern combat strategy into the earth. He didn't lead charges, he made charges possible. By the time the Civil War erupted, Meade was in his mid-40s. Cautious, reserved, unremarkable in a room full of theatrical warriors. But war isn't always won by charisma, and Meade knew how to fight. He commanded a brigade at the Peninsula Campaign, a division at Antietam, and a corps at Fredericksburg. At every level, he did his job. No frills, no panic, no pretense. By June 1863, the Union Army was reeling. General Joseph Hooker, his predecessor, had been humiliated at Chancellorsville. Morale was in the dirt, and Robert E. Lee was marching north, his army deep into Pennsylvania. On June 28th, just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln gave Meade command of the Army of the Potomac. It was not a promotion, it was a burden, but Meade accepted, and then he moved. He didn't stall. He didn't wait to build a name for himself. He followed Lee, closed the distance, found his position, and then, in the rolling hills and fields outside a small Pennsylvania town, Meade met the Confederate Army head-on. Gettysburg, 3 days. Day 1. Confederate forces push Union defenders through the town, but Meade's generals hold high ground. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill. Meade arrives late, but finds the terrain favorable. He digs in. Day 2, Lee attacks both flanks. The Wheatfield, Little Round Top, Devil's Den. Meade races reinforcements across the lines in real time. His troops hold, barely. Day 3, Lee bets everything on Pickett's charge. A full frontal assault on the Union center. Meade predicts it. Strengthens his position. When 12,000 Confederates march across open ground, under artillery fire, Meade's men unleash hell. The charge is repelled. The Confederacy bleeds. Lee retreats. The war turns. Gettysburg becomes the high water mark of the Confederacy. Meade wins. But history is cruel to quiet men. Despite his success, Meade never received the adoration he earned. Critics claimed he failed to pursue Lee aggressively enough after Gettysburg. Politicians muttered. Lincoln was disappointed. Meade had stopped the invasion, but he hadn't ended the war. Still, Meade held command of the Army of the Potomac through the end of the war. When Ulysses S. Grant took over as General-in-Chief in 1864, Meade became his field commander, working under Grant's broader strategy in the Overland Campaign, at Cold Harbor, at Petersburg. He never complained. He never betrayed his station. When Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox, Meade was there, and then he vanished from the spotlight. After the war, he returned to engineering, served in reconstruction duties, refused to write memoirs, refused to promote himself. He died in 1872 of pneumonia at the age of 56. Few monuments were raised. No political career followed. But ask any serious historian, any soldier who studied Gettysburg, and they'll tell you, Meade didn't just win a battle. He saved a cause. He inherited a broken army, met the most dangerous general in American history, and stopped him. Because sometimes the right man for the moment isn't the most obvious. He's just the one who knows how to hold. But the next general didn't hold. He charged. Through fire, through cavalry, through the wreckage of cities. He made the Shenandoah Valley burn and earned a name that still makes battlefield dust shiver. Philip Sheridan. He was short, barely over 5 feet. But on a battlefield, Philip Henry Sheridan stood 10 feet tall. Quick-tempered, fearless, unrelenting. Sheridan didn't command armies so much as unleash them. He believed in total war the way a storm believes in thunder, not as a strategy, but as nature. His cavalry didn't just ride, they shattered. His infantry didn't just march, they erased. If Grant was the scalpel and Sherman the torch, Sheridan was the hammer. And by the end of the Civil War, the Confederacy was reeling from every blow he delivered. Born in 1831, probably in Albany, New York, though even he wasn't certain, Sheridan grew up in humble Irish immigrant poverty. Raised in Ohio, he earned a spot at West Point in 1848, but he wasn't the ideal cadet. He was suspended for a year after fighting with a fellow student, drawing a saber. Still, he graduated in 1853, 34th in a class of 52. Before the war, he served in the Pacific Northwest. Quiet years, routine assignments. Nothing about Sheridan's early career suggested that he would become one of the most feared Union commanders of the war. But war has a way of finding the right man at the right moment. When the Civil War broke out, Sheridan was an obscure captain, known for order and logistics, but his talent for organizing units and his brutal clarity under pressure caught the attention of his superiors. In 1862, he was promoted to colonel. A few months later, he was a general, and then the battlefield met Philip Sheridan. At the Battle of Perryville and later at Stone's River, he commanded infantry brigades with deadly precision. But it was at Chickamauga in 1863 that Sheridan showed what made him different. The Union right collapsed. Entire corps were falling back in chaos. Sheridan refused. He held the line, counterattacked, bought time for retreating troops. When the dust settled, his name was on everyone's lips. Then came Missionary Ridge. Under Grant's orders, Union troops charged uphill toward Confederate entrenchments. Sheridan, riding up and down the line, saber raised, led his men into the breach. Confederate defenses crumbled. He wasn't just winning battles, he was breaking myths. In 1864, Grant sent Sheridan east, gave him command of the Army of the Shenandoah, and handed him a mission that echoed with brutality: destroy Confederate resistance in the Shenandoah Valley. Not defeat. Destroy. Sheridan understood the stakes. The valley was the breadbasket of the Confederacy, a corridor for supplies, food, and reinforcements. As long as it stood, Lee's army had hope. Sheridan set out to remove that hope. At the Battle of Third Winchester, Sheridan's cavalry swept through Confederate lines with devastating effect. At Fisher's Hill, he struck again, forcing Early's army into full retreat. But it was at Cedar Creek that Sheridan cemented his legacy. In October 1864, Confederate forces under Jubal Early launched a surprise dawn attack, routing part of Sheridan's army. Sheridan, returning from a meeting in Winchester, rode 20 miles toward the sound of cannon fire. When he arrived on the battlefield, the Union troops were retreating, demoralized, scattered. Sheridan didn't curse. He didn't panic. He rode down the lines, hat raised, voice booming. "Turn, boys, turn. We're going back." And they did. That day, Sheridan turned a defeat into a resounding victory. The Confederates were broken. The Shenandoah Valley was scorched. Farms, railroads, mills burned to ash. Sheridan had executed a campaign of total war with surgical cruelty. The valley was no longer a lifeline. It was a tomb. Lee would never recover. By 1865, Sheridan was leading cavalry under Grant in the Appomattox Campaign, relentlessly harassing Confederate forces. At Five Forks, his cavalry dismounted and attacked like infantry, breaking the last defensive line before Petersburg. Lee fled. Sheridan's men cut him off. The war was ending, and Sheridan had slammed the last door shut. After Appomattox, he was promoted to lieutenant general and tasked with reconstructing the South, a task he approached with the same directness as his battlefield commands. Later, he was sent west, where he played a brutal role in the Indian Wars. He famously said, or was said to have said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Whether or not those were his exact words, they reflected the ruthless policies he enacted. He oversaw campaigns that destroyed Native American resistance through starvation, forced relocations, and total military pressure. His legacy in the West is complex, effective but devastating, brilliant but merciless. He modernized the army, established new posts, helped create what would become the professional standing military of the post-war United States. In 1883, he became commanding general of the U.S. Army, the same position once held by Grant and Sherman. He died in 1888 at the age of 57. Buried at Arlington, his grave bears his full name, but history remembers him by one: Sheridan. He didn't talk much. He didn't write sweeping memoirs, but when he rode through battle, men followed. And when he looked at an enemy position, he didn't ask if it could be taken. He asked how soon. Philip Sheridan didn't believe in half measures. He believed in finishing, and finish he did. But the next general believed in something else: in dignity, in distance, in the silence after a war ends. A man who served under Washington, crossed centuries, and still stands in marble. George Washington's other general. George Meade may have won Gettysburg, but our final general, Philip Sheridan, left the battlefield burning. James Mattis. He carried a copy of Marcus Aurelius into battle and quoted Thucydides to Marines half his age. He didn't shout. He didn't scheme. He didn't chase medals or headlines. But every time the United States opened a new chapter in its long, endless war on chaos, it called on one man to write the first line: General James Norman Mattis. He was the warrior intellectual, the combat mystic, the one who knew war so intimately he could both end it and mourn it without contradiction. They called him Mad Dog, but the nickname never fit. The Marines he led simply called him Chaos. Others, especially the enemy, called him a ghost. But history will call him something else: necessary. Born in 1950 in Pullman, Washington, Mattis came into the world between wars. His father, a merchant marine in World War II, his mother, an intelligence worker. Duty ran through the bloodline, quiet and firm. He joined the Marine Corps in 1969, not for glory, but because it was the hardest path available. He read voraciously, fought methodically, rose without flash or ambition, and then he went to war. Real war, modern war, war of mud and sand, airstrikes and IEDs, ethics and brutality colliding in real time. He led a battalion in the Gulf War in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm. While the world watched Schwarzkopf's hammer fall, Mattis led from the front, directing maneuvers, keeping tight discipline, watching enemy lines dissolve under firepower so vast it silenced whole brigades. He earned respect without demanding it. And then came the war that would define him. After the September event, Mattis took command of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Brigade, preparing for the invasion of Afghanistan. He launched Task Force 58, the Marines' first major assault in the country. Helicopters flew hundreds of miles into Taliban territory with Mattis at the center of it. On the ground, not behind a monitor, he called the shots, then picked up a rifle and moved with his men. It was the first long shadow of the long war. But Afghanistan was only the beginning. In 2003, Mattis took command of the 1st Marine Division in the invasion of Iraq. The campaign was fast, lethal, relentless. But Mattis didn't just fight like a general. He thought like a philosopher of force. He carried a reading list for his junior officers: Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Machiavelli. He insisted on strategic literacy as much as marksmanship. To fight well, you had to think well. Every Marine in his division knew that. Every enemy they faced learned it the hard way. His most controversial moment came in Fallujah, 2004. A Blackwater convoy was ambushed. American contractors were killed, mutilated, hung from a bridge. The world watched in horror. Washington demanded a response. Mattis was sent to take the city. He pushed in, street by street, block by block. But just as the Marines prepared to finish the job, Politicians flinched. Mattis was ordered to halt. A ceasefire was negotiated. Fallujah wasn't taken, it was postponed. The decision infuriated his men, haunted Mattis. But he obeyed, because he wasn't just a warrior. He was a soldier of democracy. When the battle resumed months later, Mattis was no longer in direct command. The city fell, but not on his watch. He would carry that hesitation, not his own, but Washington's, like a splinter in his side. Still, he didn't quit. He rose. Commander of Marine Forces Central Command, then head of U.S. Joint Forces Command. Then in 2010, President Obama appointed him to lead U.S. Central Command, overseeing operations in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. He took over during the worst years of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Morale was low. Mission creep was endless. And in that chaos, Mattis did what few could: restore clarity. He told his troops, be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everyone you meet. It wasn't a threat, it was a doctrine of balance. He fought hard, but not blindly. He respected the enemy, but never dehumanized them. He understood tribal politics, regional fault lines, religious fractures. He read intelligence like scripture and expected his commanders to do the same. He hated euphemisms. He didn't believe in surgical wars or kinetic diplomacy. War was ugly. Death was real. And if America was going to fight, it needed to fight clean, not sanitized. But even as he mastered war, he questioned it. He urged restraint with Iran, argued that diplomacy had been underutilized, warned that aggression without endgame was folly. Eventually, these views clashed with the administration's pivot, and Mattis was quietly retired in 2013. But the Marines didn't forget him. The military never stopped quoting him. In America wasn't done with him yet. In 2016, after Donald Trump won the presidency, he tapped Mattis for Secretary of Defense. Congress had to waive the legal requirement that civilian control of the Pentagon be preserved. Mattis had retired less than 7 years prior, but the waiver passed. Because even the politicians knew Mattis was different. He took over the Pentagon with a single focus: stability. He reassured NATO allies. He reinvested in readiness. He stood between inflammatory tweets and strategic chaos. He kept the ship steady. And when the administration began pulling away from allies, abandoning Kurdish partners in Syria, undermining international coalitions, Mattis made a choice. He resigned, quietly, directly, without drama. He submitted a letter stating that America's strength came from alliances, and that leadership required both clarity and consistency. Then he left. And once again, he said nothing. No revenge book, no tour, no media storm. He returned to private life, leaving behind only his example, because James Mattis never believed the general should be the story. The mission was the story. The Marines were the story. The Republic, flawed, fragile, unfinished, was the story. He remains one of the most respected military figures in modern American history, decorated, unreadable, relentless. He once said, "The most important 6 inches on the battlefield is between your ears," and he lived it. He fought with bullets, but he also fought with books. He left no children, no scandals, no monuments, only Marines who still whisper his name at night, because he taught them something no enemy could erase: war is chaos. But it doesn't mean you have to be. And if Mattis defined modern war as a balance between fury and discipline, the next general knew something about older wars, slower wars, wars of attrition and artillery, and fields soaked in 1940s blood. Because before D-Day, before Patton's charge, before the world turned the tide, there was a general who held the forgotten line: Alexander Patch. He didn't storm the beaches at Normandy. He didn't give headline-grabbing speeches. He wasn't a face for war bonds or the subject of wartime propaganda reels. And yet, when the United States needed to land on the underbelly of Europe, when the Nazis still gripped southern France, and the Mediterranean theater was drowning in complexity, it was Alexander McCarroll Patch they called. Because Patch didn't need a spotlight. He just needed a battlefield, and once he got one, he made it count. Born in 1889 in Fort Huachuca, Arizona Territory, Alexander Patch came into the world surrounded by uniforms. His father was a cavalry officer. His boyhood was spent in and around army posts, Discipline wasn't taught. It was inhaled. He attended West Point, graduating in 1913, just a year ahead of a class that included the future giants like Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. But Patch was never drawn to politics or performance. He was drawn to command and duty, in its purest, most unadorned form. When the U.S. entered World War I, Patch served with the 18th Infantry Regiment in France. He was wounded, decorated, and promoted. He didn't make headlines, but he made a name for cool under fire, logistical precision, and the rare ability to keep men calm when everything was collapsing. After the war, he became a student of combat, graduating from the Army Command and General Staff College and the Army War College. Through the interwar years, he taught, trained, and studied. While others wrote theories about future wars, Patch kept his boots muddy and his orders clear. Then came World War II. By 1942, America was still reeling. Pearl Harbor was a fresh wound. The Pacific was a disaster zone. And on the island of Guadalcanal, U.S. forces had landed into a firestorm. The initial Marine landing had gained a foothold, but the campaign dragged on. Supplies faltered. Disease ripped through foxholes. The Japanese were counterattacking from jungle and sea. The Army needed to relieve the exhausted Marines. They needed a general who could step into the mess, reinforce the front, and finish the job. They picked Alexander Patch. He took command of the 14th Corps in December 1942. He didn't bluster, he organized. His first mission, get supplies flowing. His second, hold the line. He did both. Patch understood jungle warfare, he understood logistics, and he understood morale. Within weeks, he reoriented U.S. strategy on the island, fortifying the perimeter, launching coordinated strikes, and neutralizing Japanese strongpoints with efficiency that felt industrial. By February 1943, Guadalcanal was secure. It was the first major land victory for the United States in the Pacific Theater, and it had Patch's fingerprints all over it. For his success, he was promoted to lieutenant general, quietly, without ceremony. He wasn't looking for applause. The next year, Patch was transferred to the European theater. There he was handed command of the U.S. 7th Army, a formation that had played a key role in Sicily, but was now tasked with something even more ambitious. Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. By mid-1944, the Normandy campaign was in full swing, but to trap German forces and relieve pressure on the northern front, the Allies needed a second invasion. Down the French Riviera, beautiful terrain, brutal resistance, logistical nightmares. Patch was handed an army, a deadline, and a narrow window. On August 15, 1944, Operation Dragoon began. U.S. and French forces stormed the coast between Toulon and Cannes. Within 24 hours, the beaches were secure. Patch's 7th Army surged inland, liberating city after city, linking up with Patton's 3rd Army near Dijon just weeks later. It was one of the most swift and successful campaigns of the European War, and no one talks about it, because Patch didn't chase legacy, he chased the enemy. From southern France, he drove north through the Vosges Mountains, terrain that had broken armies for centuries. The Germans counterattacked. The winter closed in. The fighting became desperate, and then came the Battle of the Colmar Pocket, January 1945. German forces had fortified a bulge along the Rhine in Alsace. They were entrenched, supplied, and shielded by the river. The French First Army had tried to take it, and failed. Patch coordinated with them, reinforced them, devised a brutal, grinding strategy. It took 3 weeks of freezing combat, but the Colmar Pocket was crushed. Alsace was free. By March, Patch's forces had crossed the Rhine. By April, they were sweeping through southern Germany, liberating towns, crossing rivers, dismantling the final pieces of Hitler's southern defense. Patch didn't slow down. He took Augsburg, then Munich. He pushed to the Austrian border, linked up with French and Allied forces, and then the war ended. Europe was free, and Alexander Patch had done more than his part, but he didn't seek a parade. He didn't write a book. He didn't tell his story, because Alexander Patch believed that if you had to remind people you were a good general, you probably weren't one. He returned to the U.S. and was promoted to full general in 1945. Less than a year later, he fell ill with pneumonia. Complications from war, exhaustion, and a lifetime of exposure to every climate in every corner of the world. He died in 1945 at the age of 55. buried at West Point. No grand speeches, just silence. The silence of a man who never needed to shout. The silence of a general who moved mountains without asking for statues. Patch's campaigns don't appear in most documentaries. His name is not etched in the public memory next to Patton or Eisenhower. But historians know, soldiers know, the war turned on men like him. Steady, relentless, brilliant. He didn't change the war through charisma. He changed it through execution. Through the kind of leadership that doesn't make movies, but wins wars. And if Patch carved his name through forgotten roads in southern France, the next general did his work in hills soaked with rain, rocks, and regret. A man who commanded with silence and walked more miles than his troops. Lucian Truscott. He smoked like a chimney, cursed like a sergeant, and walked with the men he commanded until the soles of their boots fell apart. Lucian King Truscott Jr. didn't believe in winning wars from behind desks. He believed in hills, mud, and marching. He believed in discipline without ego, in strategy without ceremony, in combat without self-pity. His men fought with broken bodies but unbroken will. And Truscott made sure they knew he was hurting too. In an army of thunderous personalities, Patton, MacArthur, Eisenhower, Truscott was the general who didn't ask for a spotlight. He just kept showing up where the bullets were. He was born in 1895 in Chatfield, Texas, raised on horse farms, rodeo grit, and the hard realities of early 20th century America. He never graduated from West Point. He never even attended. His route to high command wasn't a ticket punched by pedigree. It was carved out of adaptation. He joined the Army as a cavalry officer in 1917, serving stateside during World War I. No headlines, no battlefield myths. But he learned fast, listened more than he spoke, and made himself indispensable. During the lean interwar years, Truscott developed a sharp understanding of what modern war would demand. He studied tactics, embraced mechanization, became one of the early pioneers of mobile warfare, and not just in theory. When the United States entered World War II, Truscott was appointed Chief of Staff of the 1st Armored Division. His rise from obscurity had begun. In 1942, he was tapped to help plan and lead the first major American offensive in the European theater, the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. There, Truscott's unique style became legend. He didn't command from the rear. He walked, miles a day, in full gear. Across jagged rock and desert heat, he matched his men step for step. He inspected supply lines, yelled at officers, checked latrines, slept in foxholes, and by the time the campaign in Tunisia ended, his division wasn't just better trained. It was hardened and ready. Then came Sicily. In July 1943, Truscott led the 3rd Infantry Division in the amphibious landings. The terrain was brutal, the heat unbearable, the German resistance ferocious. Truscott didn't flinch. His men moved with machine-like efficiency, advancing 100 miles in 6 days. At one point, General Patton himself said, "There is no one better at commanding an infantry division than Truscott." Coming from Patton, that was both rare and real. But Truscott wasn't done with Sicily. He wanted Italy. And Italy would give him hell. In September 1943, the Allies landed at Salerno. The beachhead was weak. The Germans counterattacked. The American lines teetered. Truscott's division held. Then came Anzio, one of the most controversial and devastating campaigns of the war. The plan was to land behind German lines, outflank their defenses, and push quickly to Rome. Instead, Allied forces dug in, waited, gave the Germans time to reinforce, and turned the beachhead into a killing field. Truscott didn't command the initial landing, but after weeks of bloody stalemate, he was brought in to fix it. He took command of the 6th Corps in February 1944. He inherited chaos and began cutting through it. He launched limited offensives, coordinated artillery, streamlined logistics, and eventually, when the breakout began in May, he led the charge. Rome fell on June 4th, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, and thus the headlines went elsewhere. But Truscott wasn't bitter. He kept marching. From Rome to the Gothic Line, the mountainous German defensive barrier in northern Italy, Truscott's men fought through winter, through snow, through terrain that chewed up tanks and froze ambition. And always, Truscott walked. One officer recalled, "He didn't just visit the front. He lived there. He once created what his men called the Truscott Trot, a 4-mile-an-hour march faster than standard pace, brutal in heat or snow. His logic? If I can do it, you can too. And he could. By 1945, he had proven himself more than a divisional or corps commander. He was now a strategic mind, capable of leading massive, complex operations across international lines. He took command of the 5th Army and later the 15th Army in occupied Germany. When the war ended, Truscott was there, quietly overseeing surrender terms, stabilizing regions, rebuilding order. But perhaps his most haunting moment came after the guns fell silent. In May 1945, at the memorial service for soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division at the war cemetery near Nettuno, Italy, Truscott stood before thousands of white crosses. No press, no prepared remarks. He turned his back to the crowd and spoke directly to the dead. He apologized for every mistake, for every order that cost lives. He promised them they would not be forgotten. He wept. And then he turned back to the living and walked away. No applause, no fanfare, just one man, scarred by leadership, trying to make peace with it. After the war, Truscott served in intelligence and diplomatic roles. He was eventually promoted to 4-star general in 1954, one of the few men without a West Point pedigree to reach that height. He retired quietly, died in 1965, buried at Arlington. His grave bears only his name, rank, and the wars he fought. But among the men who marched with him, who bled with him, he was something more. He was the general who didn't ask you to follow him. He just kept walking until you couldn't help but catch up. Lucian Truscott never gave a press conference, never asked for a monument, but his campaigns, North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, Rome, were among the most demanding in modern warfare, and he didn't just survive them. He mastered them, because Truscott believed in one thing above all, that the job of a general is to share the hardship, not avoid it. And while Truscott walked beside his men, the next general found himself walking a far more precarious path. Between politics and battlefields, between ambition and command, between Allied diplomacy and fascist resistance, a general who took Rome, shook hands with popes, and chased both glory and ghosts. Mark W. Clark. He was tall, polished, handsome in a way that made photographers smile and old-world diplomats lean in. But beneath the tailored uniform and steel-gray eyes was a man who didn't just want to win the war. He wanted to be remembered for it. General Mark Wayne Clark walked the knife edge between battlefield and spotlight, between necessity and notoriety, between glory and guilt, and somewhere between the ruins of Rome and the blood-soaked ridgelines of Italy, he carved out one of the most complicated legacies of the Second World War. Some thought he was too ambitious, some thought he was too political, but no one, not even his enemies, ever thought he was weak. He was born in 1896 in Madison Barracks, New York, the son of a career Army officer. Military discipline was poured over him like concrete from birth. He graduated from West Point in 1917, just in time to join the twilight carnage of World War I. He was wounded in France, mentioned for bravery, promoted young. After the war, he stayed in, studied, trained, networked. He taught at the infantry school at Fort Benning, alongside a man who would become his closest wartime partner, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The two men formed a strategic and personal bond, one built on mutual respect and rising ambition. Clark was fast-tracked through command school, staff assignments, overseas postings. By 1941, he was a brigadier general, and when America entered the Second World War, Clark was already moving faster than almost anyone else. In 1942, Eisenhower, now Supreme Allied Commander, tapped Clark as his deputy for the North Africa campaign. It was an odd choice to some. Clark had never led a division in combat. But Ike knew Clark's strength wasn't brute force. It was diplomacy under fire. In October 1942, Clark was sent on a secret mission to negotiate the surrender of Vichy French forces in North Africa before the Allied landings began. Under cover of night, he landed by submarine near Algiers, traveled inland under threat of capture, and met with French officers. The negotiations were shaky, risky, politically volatile, but Clark made it work. When Operation Torch landed in November, resistance in parts of French North Africa was less severe than expected. Clark had cleared a path, Not with tanks, but with handshakes and risk. For his work, he was promoted to lieutenant general, skipping an entire rank. At just 46, he became one of the youngest three-star generals in U.S. Army history. Then came Italy. In 1943, Clark was given command of the 5th Army, the main U.S. ground force assigned to the invasion of mainland Italy. The task was monumental. Italy wasn't Normandy. There were no beaches leading to wide plains. There were mountains, valleys, rivers, and the Germans had prepared for all of it. Clark's first major test came at Salerno in September 1943. The landings were bloody. The Germans counterattacked. The beachhead nearly collapsed. Clark's command was criticized. Poor planning, slow coordination, scattered units. But Clark didn't fold. He regrouped, reorganized, pushed forward, brought in naval fire, airstrikes, and eventually the Germans withdrew. The Americans had a foothold. Then began the long crawl north, across the Volturno River, into the Apennine Mountains, through Cassino, a fortress of stone, mud, and misery, where Allied forces bled for months beneath the shadow of a Benedictine abbey. Clark oversaw it all. And then came the most defining and controversial moment of his career, Anzio. In January 1944, Allied planners, desperate to outflank German defenses, launched an amphibious landing at Anzio behind enemy lines. The hope was to break the stalemate and race to Rome. But the landing force under General John Lucas dug in rather than attacking. The Germans responded with fury. Weeks turned into months. Stalemate. Clark, overseeing the broader front, relieved Lucas and took direct control. In May, the Allies finally broke out of Anzio, and the road to Rome lay open. But then, Clark made a decision. Instead of cutting off the retreating German 10th Army, as Allied strategy called for, Clark turned his forces northwest toward Rome. He wanted the city, he wanted the headlines, and on June 4th, 1944, he got them. American troops marched into Rome. It was the first Axis capital to fall. The newspapers lit up. Clark appeared on front pages, smiling beneath the dome of St. Peter's. But 2 days later, on June 6th, the Allies landed at Normandy. Rome was forgotten, and Clark's decision to chase symbolic victory rather than strategic advantage became a permanent stain on his record. Thousands of German troops escaped. They regrouped, and the Italian campaign dragged on for another grueling year. Clark defended his decision, insisting it was tactically sound and politically essential, but his critics, British commanders especially, never let it go. Still, he kept fighting. He was promoted to command the 15th Army Group, overseeing all Allied ground forces in Italy. He pushed through the Gothic Line, through northern Italy, through the final months of the war. In April 1945, as German resistance crumbled, Clark's forces liberated cities across the Po Valley. The war in Europe ended. Clark was there, but his war wasn't over. In 1947, he became the U.S. High Commissioner of Austria, overseeing reconstruction and political stability in a country torn between Allied zones and Soviet influence. Again, he succeeded, not with artillery, but with tact. He kept Austria neutral, stable, quiet. Then came Korea. In 1952, during the final frustrating stretch of the Korean War, Clark was appointed commander of United Nations forces. He replaced General Matthew Ridgway. He inherited a war locked in stalemate. Politically deadlocked, militarily frozen, Clark didn't win the war, but he ended it. He oversaw the signing of the armistice in July 1953, ending open hostilities on the Korean peninsula. It wasn't a clean victory, but it was containment, and Clark, once again, had done what history asked. Imperfectly, but effectively. He retired in 1953, wrote his memoirs, calculated risk, tried to explain Rome, tried to explain Anzio, tried to explain himself. Some believed him, some never would. Mark Clark died in 1984, aged 87. He was the last surviving U.S. Army general who had held a major command in World War II, and he was, as always, complicated. Brilliant strategist, or spotlight chaser, tactical risk-taker, or careless commander. The truth, as it often is, lies somewhere in between. Because Clark didn't just fight in murky wars. He reflected them, but one thing is beyond debate. He was there, at Salerno, at Anzio, in Rome, in Korea, making decisions that shaped continents and accepting their cost. He once said, "War is a job for professionals." And that's what he was. Not a saint, not a villain, a professional who did what needed to be done, even when history refused to thank him. But the next general wouldn't fight across oceans. He'd fight over Europe, in the skies, against the firebomb, the flak gun, and the deadliest gamble of the Cold War, Curtis LeMay. He didn't flinch at fire, he ordered it. He didn't whisper threats, he made them operational. When other generals talked of minimizing destruction, General Curtis Emerson LeMay calculated how to turn cities into cinders with slide rules and fuel ratios. Cold, brilliant, relentless. If war was a tool, he made it scalpel and sledgehammer. And whether commanding the skies over Tokyo or reshaping American nuclear strategy during the Cold War, LeMay stood at the edge of apocalypse, not just staring into it, but drawing up flight plans. To some, he was a monster. To others, a savior. To history, he's a permanent cautionary tale about what happens when efficiency meets fire. He was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1906, dirt poor. His father drifted from job to job, rarely finishing anything. LeMay watched, learned, hated inefficiency with a white-hot intensity. As a boy, he built model planes from trash, read engineering books for fun, and decided early that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing at full throttle. He studied civil engineering at Ohio State, joined the ROTC, and earned a commission in the Army Air Corps in 1929. He became a pilot, but more importantly, he became a planner, a thinker, a tactician who could take an impossible mission and make it operational down to the last gallon of fuel. During World War II, that talent got noticed. In 1942, LeMay was put in charge of planning long-range bombing raids over Europe. He figured out how to get B-17 Flying Fortress from England to Germany and back, under fire, through flak, dodging fighters. He didn't invent precision bombing. He made it possible. Then came Regensburg, a 1943 raid deep into Nazi territory. No fighter escort. LeMay led the formation himself. He flew in the lead bomber, over enemy skies, through clouds of death. The mission succeeded, at a massive cost, but LeMay didn't blink. He rotated out, went to the Pacific, and was told to do it again. Only this time with new tools, the B-29 Superfortress, the Japanese home islands, fire. In 1944, LeMay was put in command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Pacific. The goal? Crush Japan's war industry by bombing its cities. At first, LeMay tried high-altitude precision raids. They failed. Weather, jet streams, technical limitations. Japanese factories dispersed production. So he adapted. He dropped the altitude, stripped the bombers of defensive guns to increase payload, switched to incendiary bombs. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, were vulnerable, and then he lit the match. On the night of March 9th, 1945, LeMay launched Operation Meeting House, a low-altitude firebombing of Tokyo. In 6 hours, the city burned. 100,000 people died, more than at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The fires couldn't be outrun. The heat melted steel. Civilians were incinerated or drowned in canals trying to escape. It was the single deadliest air raid in history. And it worked. LeMay followed it with firebombings of Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. He burned 67 Japanese cities, factories, rail hubs, homes. He calculated every detail. No pretense, no apology. Later he said, if we'd lost the war, we'd all have been tried as war criminals. And he meant it. Then came August, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. LeMay wasn't part of the decision to drop the atomic bombs, but he supported it. And by the time Japan surrendered, the air war, his war, had done its job. He returned to the U.S. a 4-star general at age 39. And then he built something even more terrifying, Strategic Air Command. In 1948, at the dawn of the Cold War, LeMay was given command of SAC, the U.S. Nuclear Bomber Force. It was a shambles, poor morale, poor training, outdated equipment. He fixed it. Through fear, through discipline, through obsession. He drilled his crews day and night, installed fail-safes, designed global flight paths, oversaw the creation of underground command bunkers. He turned SAC into the most powerful and ready nuclear force on Earth. His motto was simple: peace is our profession. But peace, in LeMay's mind, meant deterrence through total destruction. He pushed for more bombs, bigger bombs, faster delivery systems. When John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he inherited LeMay and a nuclear arsenal on hair-trigger alert. And then came Cuba, October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. LeMay advised immediate airstrikes, followed by invasion. Kennedy resisted. The world held its breath. Privately, LeMay accused Kennedy of weakness. Publicly, he carried out orders, but he never stopped believing that only overwhelming force could prevent war. He had seen what hesitation looked like in 1943. He had no interest in seeing it again. After the crisis, LeMay clashed with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara over strategy and doctrine. LeMay didn't believe in flexible response. He believed in clarity. Either you fight to win or you don't fight. In 1965, LeMay retired, but he didn't disappear. In 1968, he re-entered public life as George Wallace's running mate in a third-party presidential campaign. It was a strange, controversial move. LeMay, a war hero, now standing next to a segregationist, he claimed he wanted to strengthen defense. Critics saw a different motive. He lost badly, returned to private life, and remained unapologetic to the end. He died in 1990, aged 83, still convinced the U.S. had gone soft, still convinced wars were best fought once and won completely. History remains torn on Curtis LeMay. Some call him a monster, others a necessary evil, but no one denies he shaped the modern American military more than any man who never ran for president. He took war out of the trenches and into the sky. He redefined what it meant to be a general. Not a battlefield leader, but a world shaper. And while the world feared the bomb, LeMay made sure the bomb was always ready, because to him, deterrence was not a theory. It was a promise. And promises? They came with payloads. But if LeMay fought in the clouds, the next general fought in silence. Not with bombs, but with barriers. The man who laid the groundwork for racial integration in the army. A general who had to fight for his right to lead before he ever faced an enemy. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and Jr. They didn't start wars. They weren't known for shock and awe campaigns or sweeping invasions. But in a country at war with itself, where skin color could outrank skill, and silence was often the only uniform a black man could wear, the father and son named Benjamin O. Davis fought a different kind of battle. One in which leadership came without recognition, and courage had to outrun discrimination just to get to the front line. Between them, they carried more weight than medals. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was the first African-American general in the U.S. Army. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen, the first black aviators in U.S. military history. They didn't inherit their rank, they tore it from history. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was born in 1877, just 12 years after the end of the Civil War, a time when the uniform of a black soldier was still a contradiction to many, a symbol worn proudly by men who were allowed to die for their country, but rarely allowed to lead within it. He enlisted during the Spanish-American Wars and served with the Buffalo Soldiers, the famed African-American regiments who had fought Native American tribes on the western frontier and earned respect in blood, not ink. Davis Sr. distinguished himself through quiet excellence. He didn't protest loudly. He simply performed so well with such precision that denial became more and more embarrassing for those trying to ignore him. And yet, it still took until 1940, after 42 years of service, for him to be promoted to brigadier general. He was 63. By then, Davis had already outlasted every excuse the Army could invent. He commanded black regiments, advised presidents, was sent abroad as a military attaché, because he was too visible to ignore, yet still too black, they thought, to be placed in direct command of white troops. But he never cracked, never raged. He just kept proving them wrong. He believed that dignity was the most dangerous weapon you could aim at prejudice. His son, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., came of age in the shadow of that dignity. Born in 1912, he decided early that he would not only wear the uniform, but fly it. He applied to West Point and was accepted in 1932. There, he endured 4 years of silence. No one spoke to him. No roommates, no dining companions, no camaraderie. For 4 years, the Corps of Cadets treated him like a ghost. Davis graduated 35th in a class of 276. They tried to break him. They built his legend instead. He wanted to fly. The Army said no, there were no black pilots. So Davis waited. And in 1941, as war loomed and pressure mounted, the Army Air Corps launched an experimental training program for black aviators at Tuskegee Institute. They didn't ask Davis Jr. to join. They asked him to lead it. He took command of what would become the Tuskegee Airmen, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Their mission was not just combat, it was proof. In 1943, Davis led his men into combat over North Africa. They flew older planes, received fewer resources, and were doubted at every level. And still, they excelled. Then came Italy. Escort missions for B-17 and B-24 bombers. Dangerous skies, German flak, Luftwaffe attacks. The Tuskegee Airmen developed a reputation. They didn't lose bombers. That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough to become legend. They painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs red, and soon bomber crews began requesting the Red Tails by name. Davis wasn't just a commander, he was a statement of fact. He flew 60 missions, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, silenced skeptics by performance so precise, so irrefutable, that the military had to recalibrate its excuses. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. It didn't happen because of the Davises, but it couldn't have happened without them. After the war, Davis Jr. stayed in. He rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the first black general in the U.S. Air Force. In the Cold War, he oversaw air defense systems in South Korea, served as deputy commander of the 13th Air Force. By the time he retired in 1970, he was a 3-star general. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded him a 4th star, posthumously, correcting history too late, but not too little. His father, Davis Sr., had died in 1970. Both are buried in Arlington. Their headstones face each other. There are no famous battles named after them, no sweeping campaigns, no firebombed cities. But the Davis legacy is written across every barracks, every cockpit, every field of battle, where a black soldier now stands without apology. Because they fought not for fame, but for presence. They made leadership undeniable, and in doing so, they left behind something rarer than victory: access. And if the Davises broke through the highest ceiling, the next general tried to build it, out of treaties, doctrine, and the shifting calculus of humanitarian warfare. A man who dropped bombs without firing a bullet. A general who saw combat through satellite feeds and moral dilemmas. Wesley Clark. He didn't ride a horse into battle. He didn't charge hills with bayonets or sketch arrows on bloodstained maps. General Wesley Ken Clark was a different kind of warrior. A 4-star general of fiber optics and foreign briefings, of midnight intel updates and impossible questions. He was the man the U.S. turned to when war had become diplomacy in uniform, and where success meant not conquest, but containment, not shock and awe, but stabilization. He led the first NATO war in history. He never fired a bullet, and yet, entire cities moved under his orders. He was born in 1944 in Chicago, into a world still at war. His father died when Wesley was just 4. His mother remarried a man from Arkansas, and that's where Clark grew up. Southern, bookish, and intense. He was a high achiever from the start. At 16, he was already calculating the physics of rocket trajectories and quoting Clausewitz to anyone who would listen. He entered West Point, graduating first in his class in 1966. He won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, studied economics, philosophy, and politics, while his peers were learning jungle warfare in Vietnam. Then he went too. As a young lieutenant, Clark deployed to Vietnam in 1969. It was a war collapsing into fog. Unclear goals, mounting casualties, strategic drift. Clark served with the 1st Infantry Division. He was shot 4 times in a firefight and severely wounded. nearly died, refused to go down. He received the Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Then he came home and got to work. Not on speeches, but on strategy. Through the 1970s and 80s, Clark rose steadily through the ranks of the Army. He studied Soviet doctrine, shaped NATO policy, served in the Pentagon, studied at the Command and General Staff College, and became an expert in conventional warfare strategy, and later in unconventional diplomacy. He didn't just understand the mechanics of battle, he understood what came after. And when the Cold War ended and the world cracked open into ethnic conflict, America needed a general who could lead troops and also read a room in 5 languages. It got Wesley Clark. In 1997, Clark was appointed Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the top NATO military post. He now led forces from 19 nations, across a continent still trembling from the fall of the Iron Curtain. Then came Kosovo. In 1998, Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic launched a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing against Kosovo Albanians. Villages were torched, civilians executed, refugees poured across borders. The United Nations wavered, the US hesitated, NATO moved, and Clark led it. It was the first war in NATO history. A war fought entirely from the air. For 78 days, Clark coordinated one of the most complex aerial campaigns in modern history. There were no front lines, only targets, airfields, bridges, military barracks, command bunkers. The challenge wasn't just defeating the Yugoslav military, it was avoiding civilian casualties in real time, while also managing 19 governments, conflicting agendas, and political hand-wringing back in Washington. Clark worked 20-hour days, coordinated satellite feeds, intelligence briefings, and diplomatic calls, all while fighter jets roared over the Balkans. He wasn't just leading troops, he was holding an alliance together with sheer will. And he succeeded. On June 10, 1999, Milosevic agreed to withdraw forces from Kosovo. No U.S. soldiers had died in combat. A military campaign that many had feared would drag on for years ended in under 3 months. Clark had pulled it off. And yet, his reward? A forced retirement. He had clashed with civilian leadership, pushed too hard, asked too many questions. Even during the final stages of the war, he had tried to block Russian troops from taking a key airfield at Pristina, issuing orders that were later overruled by British commanders wary of igniting a conflict with Moscow. It was the perfect metaphor for modern war. Victory blurred by politics. Clark left the military in 2000, but he didn't leave the fight. In 2004, he ran for president of the United States, believing that American leadership needed both moral clarity and strategic competence. He won debates, delivered fiery speeches, but lacked the political machinery to go all the way. He dropped out and endorsed John Kerry, returned to civilian life. But the war he had just missed, Iraq, haunted him. He had warned against it, argued that military force without a political exit strategy was disaster waiting to bloom. He had seen it in the Balkans. He tried to prevent it in Baghdad. He failed. But he didn't stop speaking. Through the 2010s, Clark remained a voice of restraint and realism in military policy. He wrote books, gave lectures, mentored rising leaders. He never became president, but every war America stumbled into after Kosovo bore his fingerprints in absentia. Because Wesley Clark represented something America rarely asks for in generals, a strategist who wins but questions the premise of war in the first place. His campaigns didn't end in surrender ceremonies or victory parades. They ended in peacekeeping forces, in temporary stability, in fragile democracies. It wasn't clean, it wasn't satisfying, but it was real. And Clark knew, in modern war, real is as good as it gets. He once said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it." And yet, in a world constantly rewriting its heroes, Wesley Clark remains remarkably intact because he did something most generals never get a chance to do. He led a war that saved lives instead of taking them. He knew that in the 21st century, wars don't end, they pause. And the job of a commander isn't just to win, it's to leave something standing that's worth the cost. Wesley Clark walked away from Kosovo without a body count, without a banner, and without a victory speech. but the people of Kosovo still light candles to thank him. And that's more permanent than a medal. Colin Powell. He stood at the podium in a crisp uniform, 4 stars on his shoulder, and told a war-weary nation that this time they were ready. The strategy was clear. The mission was limited. The exit was planned. He wasn't selling war. He was explaining why not going would be worse. And in that moment, General Colin Luther Powell became the most trusted man in America. But behind the calm voice and doctrine charts was a man who never forgot where he came from, or how easy it would have been for history to leave him behind. Colin Powell wasn't born into command. He was born in Harlem, 1937, to Jamaican immigrants. His father was a shipping clerk. His mother was a seamstress. They lived by the code of quiet dignity, education, respect, and keeping your head down in a country that wasn't always kind to men like Powell. He didn't grow up dreaming of medals or military glory. He found his path almost by accident. While studying at City College of New York, Powell joined the ROTC. He took to it immediately. The structure, the discipline, the clarity, the merit. It gave him a world where performance outweighed prejudice, at least on paper. He commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army in 1958 and walked into history, Vietnam, twice. His first tour was as an advisor, watching a slow-motion tragedy unfold. Corruption, confusion, politics tangled with jungle warfare. His second tour in 1968 was under fire. He was injured in a helicopter crash, crawled back into the wreckage to pull others out, earned a soldier's medal for heroism. He understood both the brutality and futility of that war better than most. It didn't make him cynical. It made him precise. Over the next 2 decades, Powell rose through the ranks. An anomaly in a military that still struggled with race, but one too competent to be ignored. He served as a battalion commander in Korea, as a brigade commander at Fort Carson, as a staff officer in the Pentagon. By the 1980s, he had worked under Caspar Weinberger, Frank Carlucci, and Brent Scowcroft. And then, under President Ronald Reagan, he became National Security Advisor. He was the first Black American to hold that position. He was still in uniform. In 1989, Powell was promoted to 4-star general and named chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. He was the youngest person to ever hold the job, and the first African-American. He took command of a military still licking its wounds from Vietnam. Morale was low. Doctrine was confused. The Cold War was ending, but the threats were evolving. Then came Iraq. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The U.S. had a decision to make, and Powell had a doctrine. The Powell Doctrine became legendary. It said, "Only go to war if you have a clear objective. Use overwhelming force. Have a defined exit strategy. Ensure broad public and international support." It was simple, pragmatic, devastatingly effective. Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991. Powell, along with General Schwarzkopf, orchestrated a 5-week air campaign followed by a 100-hour ground assault. Iraq's army, the 4th largest in the world, was obliterated. Kuwait was liberated, and the U.S. suffered minimal casualties. It was, in military terms, flawless. Powell's approval ratings soared. He became a household name, but he didn't gloat. He didn't strut. He warned that victory was no excuse for arrogance. He understood something the country often forgets, that wars are easier to win than peace. After Desert Storm, Powell stayed on as chairman through the early years of the Clinton administration. He helped oversee troop withdrawals from Somalia, military responses in Haiti and the Balkans, and post-Cold War downsizing. He was asked repeatedly, would he run for president? He had the poll numbers, he had the trust, he had the story. The immigrant son turned general turned national hero, but he said no, because Colin Powell wasn't chasing power. He was chasing something harder to hold on to, honor. In 1996, he published his memoir, My American Journey. It became a bestseller. He retired from public service, and then history came knocking again. In 2001, President George W. Bush asked Powell to become Secretary of State. He agreed. Once again, he would find himself at the center of war. After the September event, and Powell argued for restraint, for multilateralism, for diplomacy backed by strength. Not replaced by it, but the tide was against him. Inside the Bush administration, the push toward Iraq intensified. And then came the day that would shadow Powell's legacy forever. February 5th, 2003, United Nations Security Council. Powell delivered a speech presenting the case that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. He cited intelligence, presented satellite images, laid out chemical weapon allegations. It was meant to unite the world behind U.S. intervention. It worked. For a while. The invasion began weeks later, but the weapons? They were never found. Powell was furious. He later said the speech was a blot on his record, a failure not of loyalty but of trust. He had been given false intelligence, and he had staked his name on it. He served out his term, then left public office for good. Colin Powell died in 2021. Tributes came from every corner of the political spectrum. A soldier, a statesman, a symbol of possibility and responsibility. He wasn't a battlefield general like Patton. He wasn't a war theorist like LeMay. He was something else. A guardian of the Constitution, of the Republic, of the idea that force should be used sparingly and never blindly. He broke barriers not by breaking things, but by building trust. He believed that leadership meant standing at the edge of power and not falling in love with it. The story of Colin Powell doesn't end in triumph or tragedy. It ends where it began, with a soldier doing his duty, then stepping aside so that others could rise.